So thank you for choosing to attend this evening out of your no other choices. So as he pointed out, so I'm a psychiatrist. I grew up in Canada, went to medical school in Canada, did my psychiatry training in Canada, then was an academic psychiatrist for 6 years, and then in '91 I moved to Texas, where I've been ever since. Originally at one hospital, moved to another hospital, and then last year moved to a third hospital for a variety of reasons. Started consulting to and had set up the trauma program here in '98, so I've been coming once a month since 1998. And the weeks that I'm not here, I do a group by video conference. And then I've been consulting to the LA program since 2000. So in the course of this time, quite a few people have been admitted, all with basically big, horrible, abusive childhoods. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, family violence, general family chaos, loss of parents, which could be death, divorce, going to jail, substance abuse, depression, everything you can think of in the form of severe chronic childhood trauma. And then once they turn 18, the trauma often doesn't stop. Then you've got the abusive boyfriend, the abusive first husband, assaults, all kinds of things going on, people dying, all kinds of loss. So it's a whole melting pot of different types of trauma and loss. And the fallout from this, which I'll show you a little bit on some slides later, is everything under the sun. So that includes, not surprisingly, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorders. So if you administer what's called the SCID, Structured Clinical Interview for DSM-5 now, it's a standardized interview that makes psychiatric diagnoses. If you give that to our patient population, that I'll quickly show you later, about 80% meet criteria for PTSD, about 97% for depression. If you use another structured interview, 95% some type of dissociative disorder, 2/3 panic disorder, 2/3 obsessive compulsive disorder, 2/3 or a little under 60% borderline personality disorder, 60% substance abuse, 40% some kind of eating disorder, 40% some sort of psychosomatic disorder. So lots and lots and lots of different mental health problems, all kinds of self-defeating, addictive, self-abusive behavior. And by and large, most people come into the program are acutely suicidal. That's the #1 reason for admission. It's about kind of half Medicare, half managed care people, about 90% women, 10% men, not because that's what we want, just that's who comes in. Average length of stay inpatient, about 12 days. And then they can step down to the day program or partial program. While inpatients, they get, it varies a little bit from whether you're in LA or Michigan to Dallas, but either they get 3 hours or close to 3 hours of individual therapy, then a whole bunch of group therapy that's all part of this trauma model approach, which is the title of one of my books. And so from working in this environment, I've come up with my view of mental health. And my view of mental health basically is called the trauma model, which is one of the books. And the trauma model is set up to be very scientifically testable. So I went to a lot of trouble to go, okay, so here's specifically how the model is laid out, and here's some specific predictions of the model. If you do this research, you'll find this, according to my prediction, whereas regular psychiatry would predict this finding. So in other words, it's not just my point of view, my opinion, my perception, it's actually testable, which is the hallmark of a scientific model. It doesn't have to be correct, because virtually all scientific models eventually are outdated and revised and mostly forgotten. It just has to be testable. It has to be formulated so you can actually test it and either rule it in, rule it out, half rule it in, half rule it out. So an example of a prediction along those lines is if you go to conventional schizophrenia genetics, and which is the title of one of my books, Schizophrenia, Innovations in Diagnosis and Treatment, you'll just see a variety of different methodologies, one of which is twin studies. So the reason that the twin studies get done is because that's giving you a preliminary look into genetics. So if you interview the first identical twin, which is, now we're talking monozygotic twins, one egg, so monozygotic, and the first twin is female, the other twin is female 100% of the time. So concordance for gender in identical twins is 100%. Blue eyes, black hair, Caucasian, and so on. So some things are clearly 100% genetic, and that's why the concordance is 100%. But if you interview maybe a couple hundred identical twins, they all live in China. The first twin is a Chinese female. The second twin is also a Chinese female. And you go, oh, well, it's clearly genetic. But then you notice that when the first twin speaks Chinese, the second twin also speaks Chinese. So then you go, well, wait a minute. The concordance is 100%, but one is purely environmental, the other is purely genetic. So what the high concordance tells you is it could be genetic. If concordance is very, very low, then you know it's really not genetic at all. So this is kind of a first pass strategy. Then as a second round of research, what you could do would be adoption studies, which is a little hard to do, to find twins who are, one was adopted into this family at birth and another one at that family. But in principle, what you would find would be exactly what everybody expects. Namely, the twins are born into a Chinese-speaking family. One's adopted at birth into a Caucasian English-speaking family, moves to the United States. Lo and behold, the one who's adopted into the English-speaking family ends up speaking English, but doesn't become a white American, still is a Chinese girl. So now we know that you carry the gene for being female, or the two genes, with you. It's all 100% coming from the genome, but what language you speak totally depends on the environment. So that's how we sort out, is it totally environmental, totally genetic, or some mix of the two? And there's a series of steps, and there's all these different methodologies. But in the conventional, doesn't matter if it's bipolar, depression, schizophrenia, genetics research, if people do twin studies, they just want to see high concordance in identical twins, lower in non-identical twins, which is going to show you it could be genetic, or partly or mostly. That's the end of the discussion. It's just identical, non-identical, nothing else. The trauma model says, in general, that trauma is a big deal in the mental health field. That trauma is a big driver of what's going on in mental health. It's not the only thing, but it's a big contributor. So there's a different prediction. And the prediction is, if you do a whole bunch of identical, non-identical twins, and you're looking at now concordance for schizophrenia, it's going to be highest. So there's going to be kind of 4 groups. Instead of 2 groups, identical, non-identical, there's now 4 groups. Identical twins who are concordant for trauma, so they've both had tons of trauma, they'll have the highest concordance rate for schizophrenia. The next highest rate will be non-identical twins who are concordant for trauma. The third level will be identical twins where one was abused and one wasn't. And then the lowest will be non-identical twins, one abused and one not. So that's a very different prediction. And the reason I make that prediction is I think, and there's lots and lots of research coming out, I think that trauma is a big factor even in schizophrenia. By no means is it the only factor. But until you go, hey, trauma's got something to do with this, we have to study the interaction between the genome and what's happening in the environment, specifically severe child abuse. Until you're thinking that way, you don't think about it. So therefore you don't study it. You don't put it into your research design. All you do is look at identical, non-identical. So most of the schizophrenia research that gets done is really in a vacuum. They're studying with all these different methodologies, this gene, that gene, some other gene, some collection of genes, but they're never really systematically looking at what's happening in the environment. And even when they look at what's happening in the environment, they're not looking at childhood trauma. It just isn't in the research. So that's an example of, this is a different way of thinking, leads to a specific different prediction, which could be tested, and lo and behold, I say that's the way it'll work out, but it might not. So that's the trauma model. Then sitting on the foundation of the trauma model in general is trauma model therapy, which is the kind of therapy method that we focus on in the programs, which I'll kind of go into a little bit. So that's kind of the general background. So what I'm going to talk about now is the history of rock and roll, which I thought might be a topic of interest. But the little slice of the history of rock and roll that I start with is actually in the 19th century, and it's boring psychiatry, not rock and roll. So I'm going to kind of walk through the history of trauma, dissociation, hysteria, post-traumatic stress disorder from 1880-ish to 2016. And it's kind of the tabloid scandal of the psychiatry field. And so going through the history is going to, first of all, be interesting. There's a whole bunch of cool pictures. And then it's going to be very instructive as to what's going on in my career and currently concerning childhood trauma, specifically childhood sexual abuse, hysterical women who've got mental health symptoms, and people who are very skeptical about the reality of the trauma, and people who tend to think, oh, the trauma probably actually happened. There's a whole history of this that's been going up and down, back and forth for a century and a quarter or more now. And then after I walk through all of that, I'm going to talk about a model for weaving together all of this comorbidity. So comorbidity is, you've got depression. What other disorders go along with the depression? The disorders that go along with it are the comorbidity. Or it could be you have substance abuse. What goes along with the substance abuse? So comorbidity is basically a whole pile of different diagnoses. And in conventional psychiatry, when you look at the comorbidity levels of people in our program, it's just a hodgepodge of unrelated disorders that they have for who knows what reason. But within this way of thinking that I'll talk about after we take a break, all of this is actually intertwined facets of one common psychological structure and process. So instead of a whole pile of different disorders, a whole pile of different treatment plans, you're just looking at variations on a theme, and you can have one integrated treatment plan, which is what we do in our trauma program. Correct? So this is Jessica, who's the director of the trauma program at Forest View. So anytime I say something that's not right, she'll put her hand up and correct it. Oop, wrong direction. So this is going to be, it's all being filmed, so it'll be available. But if anybody wanted to email me for any reason, ask a question, that's my email address. So now we're in the 19th century. So this is typical, you go to an art gallery, this is a typical painting that you would see from the 19th century. And it's depicting some classical scene, I forget exactly what the scene is. And what do you notice? Well, looks like it's Romans, it's maybe somewhere in the Mediterranean. There's a bunch of women, and there's an awful lot of breasts exposed. And it's kind of hard to find any men with their genitals exposed. So, who do you think painted this? A man, right? So this is the classical thing. Nobody goes, hey, what? Just look at it. That's the way classical art is. It kind of goes by without comment. So the painter of the previous painting is this guy, Robert Fleury, and that was some classical scene. Now this is his 1876 painting of Pinel liberating the mad women of the Salpêtrière, which is the big psychiatric hospital in Paris in that time frame. And Pinel's a very famous, if you read like just an intro chapter of a book, The History of Psychiatry, Pinel's one of the guys who'll get mentioned. So all these people were locked up in these asylums, and they were often pretty disturbed and psychotic, and they were getting mistreated and kind of like caged animal treatment. And Pinel came in and was part of a different movement, so he would take the chains off the people and treat them in a much more humane fashion and find out that they do as well or even a little better. So Pinel's a sort of humanitarian, human rights kind of guy unchained the mad women of the Salpêtrière. Okay, but so why is that mad woman from the Salpêtrière showing her breast? Why has the painting got that detail in it? Well, it's partly just the painting style. That's true of all the women in all these paintings. But what do we notice now? Lo and behold, here's all the men. They're all very formal, very professional, dressed up to the necks. And here's the crazy mad women exposing themselves and being all seductive. So this is the picture of male-female relationships, male-female social roles, and insane women that dominated this time era, which is getting in the latter quarter of the 19th century. And so this is the sort of cultural foundation and starting point of when we go to the Salpêtrière Hospital, we're going to find out about Janet, Charcot, Freud, Babinski. So Charcot was the head guy of psychiatry at the Salpêtrière. People who visited there included Janet and Freud and Babinski and a lot of Gilles de la Tourette. The Tourette syndrome is named after. So a lot of the major guys in late 19th century psychiatry studied these mad women at the Salpêtrière, and from there created all kinds of theories. So this is sort of the group of patients that were studied intensely that gave rise to the major psychological theories, including Freudian theory, that have dominated the field up to the present. So it's a pretty important place. So here we have this sort of unanswered puzzle. Why are women being depicted like this? And it's not just, you have to scour through 1,000 paintings to find examples of this. So here is a book called Invention of Hysteria. And this is the star woman from the Salpêtrière. So the term, the diagnosis of hysteria, was invented by Charcot and these other guys studying at the Salpêtrière with these mad women who tended to be hypersexualized and always being seductive and exposing themselves. And hysteria in the late 19th century meant kind of what it means today, but not exactly. So what's a hysterical woman look like? Well, so the mouse runs into the kitchen, the woman jumps up in the chair and gets all hysterical, and the guy comes in and whacks the mouse with a hammer and kills it, because he's not hysterical. That's a stereotype. So hysterical means in a flap, out of control, can't cope, which is stereotypically a female thing. That's what the word means now in general English. But in a technical sense, in the mental health field, hysteria meant basically an element of that picture of hysteria, but it was a combination of histrionic theatrical personality style, post-traumatic stress disorder, and psychosomatic symptoms. So it was kind of a broad, all-encompassing umbrella that was all part of sort of a single disorder, multifaceted single disorder. When you get to DSM-3, 4, 5, this concept of hysteria has been eradicated from the manual, so you don't get the word hysteria at all. And what you get is bits and pieces of hysteria in separate sections of the DSM. So PTSD is here, histrionic personality disorder is here, the dissociative symptoms, which are a core element, are in the dissociative disorders. It's like a nuclear explosion, and we got all the fission byproducts of hysteria. And the overarching sort of how to unify this together concept is just vanished. It's just bits and pieces. There's no integrative theory or model at all. So if you're looking at the bits and pieces of fragments of the DSM, one of them is the dissociative disorder section. And I've written a whole series of books about multiple personality, so I specialize in that. I'm a scholar of that. And dissociative disorders are like orphan disorders in psychiatry. They're very marginalized, they're poo-pooed, they're not treated with the same attitude or respect as schizophrenia or depression or OCD. And the people who have dissociative disorders are marginalized in the mental health system. So they don't get the respect, they don't get really even acknowledged or noticed, they just get some meds and sort of off they go on their way. Where did the dissociative disorders field start? Back at the Salpêtrière. This is where the dissociative patients were, and this is where Pierre Janet came and studied, who's basically the founder of dissociation theory. And he wrote a series of books. Were actually very readable, interesting books that are available in English. They're not just, you know, dusty old, boring textbooks at all. They're full of interesting examples, interesting thinking, fairly easy to read language. So he talked about dissociation using the French word for dissociation. And he said that dissociation is basically traumatic events happen. It's overwhelming for your psyche. So sort of automatically and sort of as a defensive coping strategy, your mind fragments into pieces. So you can't afford to feel, know, see the whole picture all at once because it's too overwhelming. So your mind fragments. You might have some of the memory in this little sector. You might have some feelings here. You might have the physical sensation there. So it's basically fragmentation of the psyche, which he thought was due to a sort of lack of psychological toughness or lack of integrative capacity. There was really a deficit weakness kind of problem. So somebody who has this deficit weakness, they don't have enough ego glue to keep their ego glued together. So they tend to fragment and fall apart. Whereas a more resilient, tougher person would just experience trauma and not fragment. So he's the foundation guy of the idea of fragmentation of the psyche. And what you have is a fragmented section of the psyche, which I'll get into after the break. And so you don't remember the abuse, or you may remember it cognitively, but you don't feel the feelings that go along with it. Or you may feel the feelings, but you don't feel the physical sensations that go along with it. So all combinations of the bits and pieces can be available. And then sometimes, if there's a trigger or a reminder, that stored material that's in another sector or module or compartment or component of the psyche all of a sudden comes up. So you get flashbacks, intrusions, nightmares, and so on. And then it gets stuffed away again. So that was his basic model, which then becomes the basic model of the field that I work in today. So that's Pierre Janet. And he said that dissociation is really the core element of hysteria. And most of the women, most of the hysterical patients were women. So if you read Breuer and Freud's book, Studies on Hysteria, published in 1895, which is an extremely interesting book, and again, relatively easy to read. All the case examples are women. They all are, almost all, if not all, are reporting childhood sexual abuse. They have hysterical symptoms, which is PTSD symptoms, dissociation, psychosomatic symptoms, and so on. And he and Breuer together, directly link those symptoms at age 25, 35, 40, back to the childhood sexual abuse and how it affected them, and it's unresolved. And then the therapy is to try and get resolution of all that so the symptoms ease off. And the vocabulary included phrases like divided consciousness, that the person's consciousness is divided. So it's basically this pretty much the same model as Janet, slightly different language, few little details thrown in. That's 1895. And Freud went to the Salpêtrière and studied what was going on with these women. It's part of where he got his theory from. Then in 1897, there's a whole book of, quite a thick book of letters from Freud to Wilhelm Fleiss. So he had this correspondence. In 1897, he wrote a letter where he repudiated the seduction theory. So the seduction theory was the childhood sexual abuse really happened. It really affected the person, and it's still driving the symptoms that they're coming into the clinic with 20, 30, 40 years later. That's the seduction theory. What he did was he decided that the abuse never happened for a variety of reasons that are interesting to write and think and speculate about. It includes a lot of contemporary political pressure, probably some personal stuff. So he decided the abuse never actually happened, so he repudiated the seduction theory. So that's called the repudiation of the seduction theory. So now he's got this problem. Instead of, almost all women, a few guys, are coming in for treatment, they have all these hysterical symptoms, It's related back to their childhood sexual abuse. That's what's going on. And a core part of what's going on is dissociation, fragmentation of the psyche. Instead, he goes, wait a minute, we're going to completely change the model here. We're going to decide that the abuse never actually happened. This now becomes Oedipal fantasies. So in order to explain why all these hysterical women are coming in with these false memories of incest that never actually happened, he develops repression theory. So repression theory, if you stay inside Freud's thinking, repression theory applies when the memories are assumed to be false. Trauma dissociation applies when the memories are assumed to be real. Now, it's not totally black and white, all or nothing, but when the memories are thought to be at least reasonably or predominantly accurate and real, the abuse actually did happen, details could be off, then trauma dissociation theory applies. When the memories are thought to be either predominantly or entirely false, it never actually happened, there was no incest whatsoever, then repression theory applies. And then Freud carried on with repression theory, and in around 1910, 1915-ish, the trauma dissociation theory kind of died out. The influence just disappeared, and Janet was forgotten. And everybody just kind of didn't read studies in hysteria and didn't talk about that. And everybody went with the repudiation of the seduction theory, which was great for the power elite, which is predominantly male, because you just got these hysterical women claiming that all these guys are perpetrating incest. It's not real, problem solved. So it fit with the political needs of the male chauvinist power elite, basically. So Freud got a lot of points, on went the story. So back to the Salpêtrière, there's a mix of different patients at the Salpêtrière, of course. So Charcot was mainly the hysterical women ward, but there's also the back ward with the psychotic chronic people. In Switzerland, at another hospital, there was people with the diagnosis of dementia praecox, and the guy who was their psychiatrist was Eugen Bleuler. And in 1911, Bleuler wrote a book called Dementia Praecox, or the Group of Schizophrenias. So dementia praecox means early onset. So this was early onset dementia, was the picture of schizophrenia. Then he renamed it schizophrenia for several reasons, but the main reason is schizophrenia means split mind, schizophrenia, split mind. And he said that splitting is the fundamental process, fundamental phenomenon in schizophrenia. And so he also said, by the word splitting, I mean the same thing that Janet means by the word dissociation. And this is not just like a side comment. This is fundamental to the whole book and the whole Bleuler model. That splitting equals dissociation is the fundamental process in schizophrenia. And by splitting, he means splitting of, I have a table in my schizophrenia book. There's like 10, 12 different psychic functions that he named as being examples of split psychic function. So you could split a thought, a feeling, will, action, impulse, a memory, all kinds of things. So it's a very pervasive psychological disintegration, dissociation, splitting. And if you read the book, so in my book, I have a lot of quotes from Bleuler's book, where he's describing multiple personality, dissociative identity disorder, exactly the same as it's described in DSM-5 in great detail. And he's saying these people with schizophrenia have personality states that are split, that take turns being in control of the body, that identify themselves by different names, that speak of the regular person in the third person. When one of the voices goes away and the regular person's back, they don't remember what the voice said. A whole host of very detailed description. So what he's calling schizophrenia, which is split mind disorder, which is based on splitting, which is the same thing as dissociation, the clinical descriptions are actually clearly dissociative identity disorder. So there's been this massive confusion about the similarities and the differences between multiple personality dissociative identity disorder, and schizophrenia. Also in Boiler's book, there's very clear examples of cases that are definitely not dissociative identity disorder. So it's a whole hodgepodge of mix of people, all put under this umbrella of schizophrenia, some of whom are classical DID, dissociative identity disorder, some who are very different from that, who have very, very chaotic, mixed up thought processes, sentences you can't even follow logically, inventing all kinds of words, really strange delusional thinking, which people with DID don't have. But nevertheless, a substantial subgroup of people who get this label of schizophrenia are really trauma dissociation people, as described by Boiler, who invented the word schizophrenia. So this is some of the curious twists and turns in the history. And now you come up to 2016, you've got the schizophrenia field, then you've got the dissociative disorders field. The schizophrenia field is big academic prestige, top professors are getting research grants, all this genetic research. In academia, there's like no funding, nobody's talking about dissociative disorders. It's totally marginalized. And the clinicians who are the schizophrenia experts aren't thinking or talking about trauma or dissociation at all. They've totally forgotten it. The dissociative disorders people, which includes me, have got a whole literature talking about this complicated relationship, overlap, differences between dissociation and psychosis. It's very important for treatment planning, because in the United States, if you get a label of schizophrenia, you're not getting any psychotherapy. You're just getting meds and maybe a little bit of like help with housing or something. If you're under the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder, which can be the same person with the same symptoms, it just depends who they go to see. Instead of getting the schizophrenia label, no psychotherapy drugs, now their primary treatment is going to be psychotherapy, and drugs may help kind of along the way some. So it makes a very practical, huge, fundamental effect on your treatment planning. But the schizophrenia field just like doesn't think about it, doesn't talk about it, it doesn't exist, it's not a problem. But in the last 10 years especially, and so the schizophrenia model is it's a genetic brain disease, maybe slightly affected by the environment, maybe triggered by stress, but basically it's an internal genetic biological brain disease. That's the dominant model. Everybody says it's a biopsychosocial model, but then when they really start paying for research, doing research, publishing, providing treatment, it's like the bio is everything and the psychosocial kind of disappeared, which is why you don't get trauma in the twin studies. So there's always lip service to, of course, the environment's important. We know it's nature and nurture. It's not all one, it's not all the other. And everybody will go, well, we never said it was just biological. But then when you see how they actually operate and behave, the psychological and social part just kind of like, it's merely lip service. It doesn't really affect what kind of research gets funded, who gets the promotions in academia, who's a professor at the top school, who gets the awards, and it doesn't affect the majority of the treatment for psychosis. This is the state of the field currently. So back to the Salpêtrière. So I'm kind of going back forward to fill you in on the history here. So this is the woman at the Salpêtrière, and if you remember the previous pictures of the mad women of the Salpêtrière, well, we don't quite see her breast there, but I mean, that's a very softcore porn, sexually suggestive picture, clearly. And this is, I'll show you the color version of this later. This is a very famous painting. So this is Charcot, who's the head psychiatrist at the Salpêtrière. This is all the famous visitors. So I think, I can't remember for sure, I think this might be Babinski. But so like Babinski, Freud, Janet, all these guys were in the audience at various different times. And what they're watching is Charcot is demonstrating the symptoms of hysteria. And what does hysteria look like? Well, we already know from Pinel painting what hysteria looks like. It's a woman whose breasts aren't quite exposed, but getting close there, and she's being hysterical to the max. So he has these women come in, demonstrate hysteria, and all these professionals, all clothed up to here, just being professionals, scientists, doctors, are studying hysteria. That's the whole setup. But what is it they were actually doing? So this is some other lithographs of what's going on at the Salpêtrière. So this is the lab, which is described in great detail in the historical documents. So the women were forced to take off all their clothes, brought into the lab, and studied by the doctors. And this is another example. So it's the same thing. They're all dressed in big clothes. Nothing sexual going on here. We're just scientists. We're just interested in studying hysteria. And we're getting all these naked women to parade around in front of us for purely medical reasons. I doubt if all the women are buying this story. So here we are back to the star patient at the Salpêtrière. So there's a whole series. I mean, you can't get more sexually explicit, provocative, and obvious than that. And here she's in a catatonic posture. So there's several photos of her catatonic, which is something that happens to people with schizophrenia who are psychotic. One of my, within the last year, papers that I published, it's 100 people in the trauma program who are highly dissociative, and we gave them the most used standard measure of catatonic symptoms, and lo and behold, they got tons. And the catatonic symptoms are statistically clearly strongly related to the amount of childhood trauma they've experienced, based on a standard measure of childhood trauma. So it's not two separate worlds. Schizophrenia, genetic brain disease with catatonic symptoms, hysterical women over here that we don't even have to take seriously. Some of the so-called core symptoms of the brain disease people, such as catatonia, are equally, if not more common in the hysterical women. So I mean, again, it's like, if you put this in whatever Penthouse or Playboy magazine, it'd be a little boring because she's too heavily clothed, but it's clearly kind of sexually provocative, suggestive. And there's various catatonic postures. So these people will be in these postures for hours and hours and hours and hours on end. Our people don't do the hours and hours at end. They have shorter bursts of it, but the same type of symptoms. This is a hysterical sleep. The person's in a sleep state, but they're not actually nighttime asleep. They're just sort of in a hysterical coma. Now we get to the rock and roll part. So this is one of the star patients at the Salpêtrière who's got this hysterical wink. So that's Miley Cyrus. So that doesn't tell you anything, but it's just kind of curious that she looks fairly similar, like that could be her sister, and it's the same hysterical wink. So just hold on to that thought. So that by itself proves nothing. Okay, so here we have at the Salpêtrière people who have psychosis, genetic brain disease, are being studied by Charcot, but as we'll see in subsequent slides, they're actually trauma victims to the max, and their hysterical symptoms are PTSD, dissociative, psychosomatic symptoms clearly related to their trauma, as stated by Freud in 1895. And here we have Miley Cyrus, again, looking similar and the same expression. Proves nothing. It's interesting. So now we're going to walk through English translations of some of the original documents. What was this learned professor who's really the father of neurology, greatly respected in all the textbooks, sometimes a little bit criticized for his studies of hysteria, but he's like a mainstream, revered, leading, one of the top few guys of the 19th century. What was he actually doing? Well, here's a description. Charcot, of course, often examined cases of retrograde amnesia, which means can't remember what happened before, following nervous shocks. Oh, okay, so nervous shocks. That's code for being raped, molested. He considered anterograde amnesia, amnesia going forward in time, the impossibility of registering actual facts in the memory, to be a hysterical type symptom, because, as he said, this amnesia is in reality only apparent, meaning it's not real organic brain amnesia, it's only apparent, it's hysterical. Those women, they're always up to stuff. Apparent, but effective. Charcot, faced with the extreme lability of historical amnesia, means it's up and down, it's not stable, drew on a territorial concept of memory derived from Gall and Ribot. So he's aware that these people have amnesia. He's aware that it's hysterical, but it's only apparent. So it's not like the real neurological stuff. But he's clearly saying there's lots of amnesia going on in this population. And here's Freud, who visited. Freud came to believe that the specificity of hysteria's cause lay in a precocious and cruel experience of sexual assault, which symbolizes itself and replays itself in a converted form in the attack. So this is the epileptic pseudo-seizure attack. And this is Freud's theory by Freud. And Charcot, he was supposed to believe this as well, though he never mentioned it. So Charcot apparently believed it, but he would never say straight up, these symptoms come from real sexual assault that really happened. This is suggested by the famous anecdote of an aside between Charcot and Braudel during a reception, surprised by the young Freud's sharp ears. Charcot murmured, "But in such cases, it's always a question of the genitals. Always, always, always." So again, he's skirting around it. He's not saying it directly, but this means sexual abuse. Freud recounts that he crossed his arms over his stomach, Freud did, hugging himself and jumping up and down on his toes several times in his own characteristically lively way. "I know that for a moment I was almost paralyzed with amazement and said to myself, well, but if he knows that, why does he never say so?" So this is Freud, who's still in the seduction theory. And he's going, Charcot knows it's all about abuse that actually happened. Why doesn't he say so? Until Freud himself decided the abuse never happened. Charcot's method of medical study. So here we are. He sits down near a bare table and immediately has the patient to be studied brought in. The patient is then completely stripped. The intern reads the, quotes, observation while the master listens attentively. Then there is a long silence during which he gazes. He gazes at the patient and drums his fingers on the table. Then he instructs the patient to move in a certain way, makes her speak, asks her for her reflexes to be measured, for her sensitivity to be examined, and again he falls silent. Charcot's mysterious silence. Finally, he brings in a second patient, examines her like the first, calls for a third, and still without a word, compares them. So this is, in modern parlance, a strip club. This is a bunch of guys who get together and have naked women walk around in front of them and stare at them for long periods of time and get them to assume certain postures. This sounds like real medicine. This sounds like scientists studying objective phenomena. Or does it sound like a bunch of weirdo men who've got some sort of strip club brothel thing organized here, and this is what was really going on in all these professors who are the foundation of our field? Well, the answer will be forthcoming. Okay, here's another description. Monsieur Charcot approaches the bed where the patient is lying. On her left side, which has been denuded, stripped, he places the four fingertips of his right hand just above the fold of the groin. So he's getting pretty close to the genitals. He then guides his hand towards the lower pelvis, applying a progressively stronger compression to the abdominal wall. Soon the patient gives out a piercing cry, opens her eyes, and immediately begins a convulsive attack, pseudo-seizure. First, there are several grand movements of salutation. So these people were called grand hysterics, really big, similar to those that had previously been spontaneously demonstrated during the sleep. Then the position of arc de cercle, which is your head's on the floor or on the bed, your feet are on the bed, and you're arced up in this kind of seizure posture. That's a symptom of grand, not regular boring hysteria, grand hysteria. Monsieur Charcot, who had maintained his hand on the left ovarian region this whole time, addressed himself to the audience. This, gentlemen, is not quite what I was trying to bring about. So we have the gentleman scholar addressing the other gentleman, speaking in medical language. Meanwhile, he's groping this woman who's having piercing cries and having hysterical symptoms. This was the show. So Ambrose Paré was a very famous guy in the history of medicine. Ambrose Paré from few centuries earlier. Ambrose Paré, to take but one example, informs us that the womb, so this is the theory of hysteria before it was really crystallized in the late 19th century. The womb, out of a natural instinct and a peculiar faculty, recoils from things that stink and enjoys the fragrant. You may not have known this about the female uterus. The therapy deduced from this was to have the women inhale the most horrid smells through their nose: bitumens, sulfur and petroleum oils, woodcock feathers, hair of men, and billy goats. This forces the womb to descend. Inversely, it was advised to maintain the neck of the womb open with a spring. So these guys are basically some sort of S&M bondage club guys who are inserting a spring into the woman's vagina, and then, with the help of instruments made especially for the purpose, fumigate the vagina with sweet smells. Incidentally, they would cry loudly in the patient's ears during the operation and would pull the hair on her temples and the back of her neck, or rather the hair of her shameful parts, so that she would not only remain awake, but so that the pain experienced on the bottom forces the vapor that is rising up and inducing the suffocation to be withdrawn and pulled back down by the revulsion. This is like, if you did this today, your license would be removed and you'd be jailed as some sort of sexual pervert, sexual offender. You'd be on the sexual offender list for the rest of your life. But this is what the doctors were doing for several hundred years before Charcot, and in other writings using these kind of methods 10 or 20 years before this late 19th century Charcot period. And this was the foundation of the theory of hysteria. Notice that the word hysteria is the same Latin root as a hysterectomy. The theory of hysteria was the wandering uterus. It's caused by a wandering uterus that kind of goes left, right, up, down, and these guys are trying to adjust it with this fumigation technique. It's absolutely crazy. And this is mainstream medicine and psychiatry. Okay, now we're getting into the star patient. The passion for contact can be illustrated instrumentally by the perfection of an intravaginal method of ovarian compression, introducing the index and middle finger into the hysterical woman's vagina during the attack to grasp the ovary, he said, and to place it back in place, like Ambrose Paré, thus stopping the painful state. So this is published in 1893. So there's actual literal digital sexual assault of the patient to stop her hysteria. Completely approved by mainstream medicine and published by the mainstream publishers. Which you would think, if I just told you this and there was no documentation, you'd say, that's impossible, that's ridiculous. You're some sort of conspiracy nut, it never happened. So BRIQUET'S treatment for hysteria. So hysteria was also called BRIQUET'S syndrome. And I can't remember if I don't think it's in DSM-5, but in DSM-4, somatization disorder brackets BRIQUET'S syndrome. In 1859, not 25 BC, 1859 in Paris, BRIQUET was still arguing against certain methods for terminating hysterical attacks, meaning that they were still in use. BRIQUET goes so far as to provide examples of their efficacy. So they work, but he was making a slightly different point. He was arguing against a concept of hysteria that was in fact grounded in the efficacy of such methods. Uterine compressions, all kinds of confrications of the genital areas. So these guys don't go, well, we were molesting the patients. They go, we were conducting confrications of the genital area, trying to make it sound all medical. Masturbating them, let's face it, until they could take no more, and extenuated exuding hysteric is pacified, and even prescriptions for coitus. So they were prescribing sex to cure the wandering uterus on the hysteria. Or if the husband couldn't do it, they'd be doing digital rape themselves. BRIQUET had tried all of these, of course, but he said they did not work. So this is a guy who's still an iconic historical figure in the DSM up to DSM-4. So here we have Augustine, who you saw the series of pictures of. She's the star patient. And here's a description of her. This is a medical description, not a softcore porn novel. Augustine is tall, well-developed, neck a bit thick, ample breasts, underarms, and pubis covered with hair, with a determined tone and bearing, temperamental, noisy, no longer behaving in the least like a child, She looks almost like a full-grown woman, and yet she has never menstruated. She was admitted for paralysis of sensation in the right arm and attacks of severe hysteria preceded by pains in the lower right abdomen. She was 15 and a half. So at 15 and a half, she was admitted as a psychiatric inpatient with hysterical symptoms. And she was kind of voluptuous, kind of sexy. But she hadn't started menstruating. Augustine is blonde, tall, and broad for her age, and in all respects gives the impression of a pubescent girl. She is active, intelligent, affectionate, and impressionable, but also capricious, and quite enjoys attracting attention. She is a coquette, it means a sexualized flirtation person, taking great care in her toilet and in arranging her thick hair. So toilet doesn't mean going to the toilet, it means makeup and hair and everything. And arranging her thick hair now one way, now another. Ribbons, especially brightly colored, are her bliss. So this is the picture of the hysterical female. She's flirtatious, sexualized, vain. She just loves ribbons. So it's an extremely belittling, demeaning, chauvinist picture of a hysterical woman. This drama is represented here by the troubling incidence of a symptom that Augustine presented at the very time that all these photographs were being taken. She could no longer see colors. She saw everything in black and white. And she would also say, perhaps even repeating herself till her head spun, "I don't have the time, I don't have the time." And then, "I'm telling you tonight I can't. He swore he'd kill me." Okay, so just like crazy ramblings that mean nothing about nothing. "I can't tonight, I can't tonight. He swore he'd kill me." What's that all about? Yeah, just hysterical women, they have seizures, and you gotta digitally rape them in order to help them feel better, and they say stuff that makes no sense for no reason. Yet Augustine had visions and heard voices, auditory hallucinations. And something like a secret was not only released, but was at play. With moist lips, she demonstrated this through 100 gestures. It became clear that she was falling under the influence of imaginary visions caused by the body alone. So this is a biological problem. Her body was genetically imbalanced, deranged, chemicals off or something, and causing her to have visions. Thus, pure illusions, just illusions. And official medicine was most careful to denounce the false allegations of hallucinating hysterics. So these are hysterical, hallucinating women who are making false accusations, which the medical profession had to denounce. Most often, she had visions of rapes, blood, more fires, terrors, and hatred of men. Why? Well, because she's hysterical. Her body's out of control. So this is the official analysis of these cases. Augustine sees an imaginary lover whom she calls. She lies down, staying to the left side of the bed, showing the place she has made for him beside her. We have to study this scientifically. She closes her eyes, her physiognomy denoting possession and satisfied desire. Her arms are crossed as if she were clasping the lover of her dreams to her breast. At other times, she clasps the pillow. Then come little cries, smiles, movements of the pelvis, words of desire or encouragement. After less than a minute, everything goes quickly in a dream. She raises herself up, sits down, looks upward, joins her hands together like a supplicant being a religious person who's praying, and says in a plaintive tone, "You don't want me anymore?" Yeah, more crazy talk that has nothing to do with anything, but obviously highly sexualized behavior. Ether, so she was given ether, which puts you to sleep. It was used as an anesthetic. And she was given ether over and over and over and over and over and over until she became addicted to it. So they actually turned her into a drug addict. But I wonder why the scientists want to give her ether to watch her behavior. Ether made Augustine gently sway her legs and pelvis as she aggressively recounted the details of her rapes and loves. All illusions, which we denounce. Everything. Showing the photographer everything. "That's how you make babies," she confided to him. These inhalations of ether and chloroform became part of Augustine's daily experience. And I mean daily. Continually, the novice drug addict would loudly clamor for the drugs, steal them, nearly overdose on them. On March 3rd, she inhaled 125 grams of ether. From that day until March 8th, she was faint with strange ideas in her head, etc. Last night, from 7 to 8, she had 17 epileptiform attacks, pseudo-seizures, followed by 8 hysteroepileptic attacks. When she woke up this morning, she said she felt like a drunken woman. because she was intoxicated on ether. But it's all sexual stuff with these seizures thrown in there. For a few instances, she remained with her arms in a cross, crucifixion. So there's also this religious mania component to it. Then delirium, all mixed up for no reason. What do you want? Repeated. Nothing, nothing. Smiling physiognomy. See, that's medical word there because we're medical doctors. That's fine. She looks to her left, half rises, makes a sign with her hands, blows kisses. No, no, I don't want to. More kisses. She smiles, makes movements with her stomach and legs. You're starting again. That's not it. She complains and laughs. You're leaving? Her physiognomy expresses regret. Augustine cries. VT 38 degrees, abundant vaginal secretions. This means that after she had a hysterical fit, where she was obviously interacting with somebody who had had sex with her, they inserted a thermometer in her vagina, measured the temperature, and noted that she was having abundant secretions. Because they're just studying things medically here. The attack is very violent, arms and legs and twists and turns, piercing pains. As for Augustine, she was prey to incessant deliria of rape. So she's just having these delirious, psychotic, mental illness, delirious ideas of rape, which we denounce and know are just made up. Pig, pig, I'll tell Papa. Pig, how heavy you are, you're hurting me. C, told me he'd kill me. That thing he showed me, I didn't know what it meant. He spread my legs. I didn't know it was a beast that would bite me. Not too hard to figure out what she's talking about there. Here's what it was all about. The rape of Augustine, then 13 and a half, by C, her employer, in whose home she lived, and who was, moreover, her mother's lover. So she was raped by her mother's lover, who was her employer, and she lived in his house. That's what all these symptoms are about. C, after making all sorts of dazzling promises and giving her pretty dresses, etc., seeing that she would not give in, threatened her with a razor. Taking advantage of her fright, he forced her to drink some liqueur, undressed her, threw her on the bed, and consummated relations. Notice they don't say he raped her. He consummated relations, as if it was a relationship. The next day, Augustine was unwell. She had lost some blood and had pain in the genital area and could not walk. The following day, she came downstairs, and since she refused to kiss C, as was customary, and turned pale at the sight of him, Madam C became suspicious. During the meal, C continually threw her threatening looks to keep her silent. Since her malaise continued, it was attributed to the first appearance of her menses. She was actually bleeding from rape. A few days later, the attacks broke out. She eventually gets admitted to the Salpêtrière, and her delirium gets studied by the scientists who have treatment methods like watching her naked for prolonged periods of time and digitally raping her. The history of Augustine shows us to what extent she was neglected in childhood. This is a contemporary writer. Her mother's behavior and the relations that the brother established between the sister and his friends explain in large part the loose conduct of the patient. So she was also molested by her friends' brothers, and she had loose conduct, which is due to her depraved moral nature and her mental illness, but in fact obviously is just a symptom of serious childhood sexual trauma. Augustine went through the ordeal of this theatrical distress on the day when, from among the spectators of the clinical lecture who had come to watch her reiteration and pantomime of an antiquated but always present rape, she recognized the rapist in person. So C, the employer, her mother's lover, who raped her when she was 13 and a half, came to one of the sessions to sit with the scientists and medical doctors to watch her display of hysterical symptoms as Charcot paraded her around. Who had come to eye something he might very well have considered for a moment to be his own work. Augustine was utterly terrified and had 154 attacks in a single day. I don't want to feel you near me. Why was I hiding my face at the lecture? Because of you. So she has 150 attacks after her rapist is brought in and sits there like the gentleman who's just studying her medically along with the other gentleman. And we put that down to hysteria and her body controlling her uterus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did things actually work at the Salpêtrière Hospital? In the hell of the Salpêtrière, hysterics incessantly made eyes at their physicians. It was a kind of law of the institution of the asylum itself. This institution was structured as a bribe. In fact, every hysteric had to make a regular show of her orthodox hysterical nature, love of colors, looseness, erotic fantasies, and so forth, to avoid being transferred to the severe division of the quite simple and so-called incurable alienated women. So if you didn't display on demand the symptoms of hysteria and act seductive towards the doctors, which necessitated them digitally raping you as a treatment, you were transferred to the back ward and that was it, you were done. Seduction was thus a forced tactic. Hail Salpetriere weighing and distributing its poor souls to more or less appalling circles, of which the service of hysterics, with its experimental component, was like an annex of purgatory. The bribe went something like this: either you seduce me, showing yourself in this way to be hysterical, or else I would consider you to be an incurable, and then you will no longer be exhibited, but hidden away forever in the dark. So there's this massive behavior control, punishment reward system. So what happened in the end? April 6th, Augustine had relapsed. She has been returned to the service as a patient. So trial discharge didn't work. The compressor, ether, compressor is compressing her ovarian region, and chloroform are used to suppress the attacks. More addictive drugs. On several occasions, she's seen to have periods of agitation, during which she breaks and shatters windows, rips the straitjacket, etc. So really out of control, violent person, who's actually just having a completely normal, understandable reaction to her sadistic, sexually perverted tormentors. On June 11th, as her agitation had become more violent, she was put into a cell. So she herself put an end to her existence as a case. She disguised herself as a man, how ironic, and fled the Salpetriere. So basically, she had to escape in the end. So there's the Salpetriere show. This is patients in hysterical catatonic postures. And this is the Miley Cyrus show. Do you think that looks a little sexualized? Maybe. So what's going on with Miley, do we think? This is her at age 15. Age 15, that's her on the cover of Vanity Fair. So if you were like a neighbor and you had her come over to your house and you took photographs like that of her and you put them on the internet and somebody downloaded them from another state, you would be a sexual offender, you would be charged and convicted of transmitting child pornography across state lines, and you'd be on the sex offender list for the rest of your life. But as long as it's on the cover of Vanity Fair, that's okay. And this is like ancient history now. This is Billy Ray Cyrus, her father, whose hit song was Achy Breaky Heart. And this is her at 15. So if you didn't know that was her father, you'd think that was her older boyfriend. I mean, look where her arm is. I mean, and look, the whole thing is. So I don't know at all. I have no evidence whatsoever. But this is a woman with highly sexualized acting out as part of her act, highly exhibitionist, provocative sexual behavior, who's getting reinforced financially massively, and lots of men are making millions of dollars off of her. And I would be, if I was doing a psychiatric evaluation of her, or I was her treating psychotherapist, I'd be tiptoeing into the question of whether she's a paternal incest victim, which would just be our current day variation on studying Augustine and the other hysterical women for profit and fame. So here we are, that's the color version of that. There's Augustine, putting on the show. And here we have the New Yorker magazine. So this is an article by a woman who identifies herself as a feminist, writing about the politics of hysteria and multiple personality disorder. So she belongs to a sort of camp called the false memory people, who in 1992 formed an association called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, because the two founders of it, their daughter accused her father of incest, childhood sexual abuse, which she remembered outside therapy without any therapy. And so they formed this whole organization to discredit victims of childhood sexual abuse and say it's all false memories, just like Freud's repudiation of the seduction theory, just like Charcot. So they didn't use the words deliria in the 19th century vocabulary, but they were basically saying the same thing. These women just have all these crazy memories for no reason, make things up, and we have to study them, but we certainly don't believe the memories. So she's kind of in that camp, saying that she's a feminist, but characterizing predominantly women with multiple personalities as suggestible hysterics, who just will do anything for attention, like have a pseudo-seizure, which we don't really treat with digital rape anymore, but maybe we should start again. And what happens is these hysterical, suggestible women who don't know their own minds and can't think for themselves and are totally impressionable, they go to see a therapist, and the therapist says, did you ever attend cannibalistic ritual ceremonies with Martians? Oh yes, doctor, Martians, oh yeah. So like you just make this littlest tiny suggestion, they just eat it up and believe it and feed it back to you as real memories. That's the picture. And these unfortunate women go to see therapists who say, oh, do you have a bunch of people inside who take turns being in control of your body, and the reason you have that is because you were abused by your dad? Oh yes, doctor. That's the picture. Just a little suggestive questioning, and they just buy it right away and start doing the show. The show now being the multiple personality show. And she's talking here about Diane Humanansky, who was sued for malpractice, and I was a defense expert in that case in Minnesota. So I've been like right in this history. So her picture as a feminist of women is that they don't know their own minds, they're weak-minded, they're hysterical, they make up crazy memories for no reason, they do anything to get attention, and what you have to do is just ignore all of that, not believe it, not buy into it, and maybe it'll all go away. And this is published in the New Yorker magazine. So the New Yorker, of course there's like 1 million articles in the New Yorker, but in this article, they're taking the position that Charcot took at the Salpêtrière, that Freud took when he repudiated the seduction theory, that this is all false memories and a bunch of hysterical women. In the same issue, we have the revenue source for the New Yorker. So the New Yorker, for this issue, made money by selling issues and through subscriptions and through advertising. So this is a statue that you could buy. So while they're attacking women as being hysterical people who make up false memories for no reason, and attacking the therapists for buying into this, they're actually selling statues of naked women for profit. Femme éternelle, the eternal woman. And this is Courtney Love. I mean, is that a little sexualized? So we're selling sexually provocative softcore pornography, because it's a clothing line, in order to get money to print an article that says these women are just a bunch of hysterics, while we're sexually victimizing them and exploiting them for profit. Exactly what was going on at the Salpêtrière 100 years previously. Nothing changes. So here's one of my books, which was 1995. So we had lots and lots and lots and lots of people coming to the trauma program. This would be in Dallas at this point, with diagnosis of multiple personality disorder, saying that they grew up in satanic cults and were abused in satanic ceremonies. No evidence that any of it was real. Impossible to prove it never happened, because you can't prove that something never happened. So there's this big controversy, and this is where the false memory people came in and said, oh, these crazy therapists are making these people believe they grew up in satanic cults. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these people who jointly are describing thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of ritual sacrifice of children, not a single one of which have ever been prosecuted and for which there's no objective evidence. So yeah, it could very well be there's some false memories thrown in there. But the question is not to have a big war about are the memories real or not real, are we going to believe, not believe. That's what the professionals got in a big fight about. So there's one group that says it's not real, one group that says it is real, and those two camps had a big war. And there was tons of lawsuits and all kinds of articles and documentaries on TV and so on. Well, that's all fine. Have a big argument. This team fights this team and we'll see who wins. In the meantime, what are we going to do for these people who are coming for treatment, who are acutely suicidal, depressed, substance abuse problems? Well, the people in the war are not talking about that. So the purpose of the book is, okay, so here's these people, they come in, and the basic summary of the book is, I, the field, should adopt the position of therapeutic neutrality. I don't know that the memories are real. I don't believe them. I equally don't know for a scientific fact that they're not real. So I don't not believe them. So the war is, you either got to believe them or not believe them. And those are the only two positions you can take. I say, no, there's a third position, which is neutrality. I neither actively believe and I don't actively disbelieve. I got to work with this person to figure out how can I shift there from acutely suicidal, so I'm not going to kill myself and I'm okay to go home now. And so the whole question of do you believe the memories, not believe the memories, are they real or false, is basically completely irrelevant to how you do the therapy. And then I go into great detail as some techniques that are useful. Published in 1995. So my favorite table from this book is there's kind of a historical background to it. So I talk about the history of Satan, the witch trials and so on, the Catholic Inquisition. So this is 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum, which is basically the operations manual of the Catholic Inquisition. This is the manual that teaches the inquisitors how to go about figuring out if somebody's a witch and they need to be burned at the stake. This is an 1851 essay by the German philosopher Schopenhauer entitled On Women. This is DSM-3R. We could jump to DSM-5, 2013. This is DSM-3R, 1987. The criteria for borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder. Okay, so the vocabulary has changed, but it's basically exactly the same picture. The picture of a witch, about 500 plus years ago, the picture of a woman in general, according to the male chauvinist pig German philosopher in the 19th century, and the picture of two mental disorders afflicting mostly women in the late 20th century are all the same thing in different vocabulary. So these people we've been calling witches and burning at the stake. That's the last witch was burned at the stake in Scotland in 1797. So now we get into the 19th century, we're not burning them at the stake anymore. Even though that was for their own good, because the reason it was for their own good was that released their soul from the influence of the demons and they could now go on to the afterworld. So we're just being kind and helpful by burning them at the stake. That was the ideology of the Catholic Inquisition. Then what happened is in the 19th century, control of the witches shifted from the Catholic Church to the medical profession. The vocabulary shifted from demon possession to hysteroepilepsy. These people are now afflicted with wandering uteruses and mental disorders. So instead of the church is in charge, the doctors are in charge. Instead of possession, it's hysteria. Instead of burning them at the stake, we now digitally rape them and put strange fumes up their vaginas and press on their ovaries and don't believe any of their abuse memories. And then by the late 20th century, we've got official diagnostic criteria because we're scientists and we've studied these women and we know what their symptoms are. But we just laugh at those people who thought it was a wandering uterus because we're not like them. We're completely different. But our description is exactly the same. It hasn't changed. It's the same story. This male chauvinist pig dominance, discrediting the survivors and sexually victimizing them, laughing at them, belittling them, publishing learned treatises about them and making money off of them, just like the New Yorker does. So then we get to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. We'll take a break in a second. So it was formed in 1992, and it was a very organized group of people, a big board of distinguished professionals, and they were basically supplying all the expert witnesses in hundreds of lawsuits against therapists for implanting false memories. So people were losing their licenses, having huge increases in their malpractice premiums, treatment centers were getting closed down. It was a big, high-stakes game. The chief psychiatrist in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was Paul McHugh. And this is a quotation from a publication of his from February 2014. The other path was that followed by Sigmund Freud, who studied under Charcot from October 1885 through February 1886. So same history. Freud was fascinated by Charcot, and particularly by his interest in the use of hypnosis to draw out memories of past events. In an obituary, Freud claimed for Charcot the glory of being the first to elucidate hysteria. But Freud rejected any idea of a mysterious neuropathology in persons afflicted by hysteria, the wandering Utis model. Instead, he proposed hidden psychological mechanisms at work in the patients. Back in Vienna with his fellow psychoanalyst Joseph Breuer, he studied the case of Anna O., a young woman with considerable intellectual ability, but with complicated and changing hysterical symptoms. Through their collaboration in this case, Freud and Breuer came to the idea that some kind of traumatic memories haunted all patients with hysteria, and that what was needed was to have these memories swept away by talking them through, ideally under hypnosis. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences, was the aphorism the two men advanced. It is remarkable, even breathtaking, to realize that despite all the changes in theory and practice that Freudian psychoanalysis underwent over the following decades, this basic idea, heal by remembering, has never been questioned. It remains today the fundamental concept behind the multiple personality disorder and recovered memory crazes. So, as you'll see on the next slide, his picture of the Salpêtrière is, there was these hysterical women. Charcot was trying to be a scientist, but unwittingly he was putting the hysterical women on the same ward as people who had actually had seizures. And they just started copying the seizures for attention. That's hysteria. So you have to not feed into it, you have to poo-poo it, you ignore it, it'll just go away. But if you reward it and reinforce it, you just get more and more and more. And that's what multiple personality is. And along with it is these false memories of abuse that never happened. So he's disagreeing with Breuer and Freud's model from 1895, which is the abuse really happened. He's agreeing with the repudiation of the seduction theory. And he's saying that repression theory is just this bogus Freudian concept. And it's just stoking up all these false memories. And it's not real, it's not respectable. But he's got it all mixed up. What he's actually disagreeing with is the trauma dissociation model from 1895 Studies on Hysteria, the book with Breuer. What he is agreeing with is post-1897 repudiation of the seduction theory that the memories never took place, it's just a bunch of hysterical women trying to get attention. Freud developed repression theory to explain why these hysterical women are having these false memories. But then Paul Mayhew goes, oh, well, this multiple personality false memory craze is all driven by this crazy repression theory. He's completely got the scholarship of Freudian theory wrong. But he's testifying all over the place that this therapist committed malpractice by implanting these false memories. And there was an epidemic at the Salpêtrière. As for the epidemic, it emerged when patients under Charcot's supervision at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris began to display convulsive contortions during his rounds. So that's very demeaning language, convulsive contortions. Thanks to a prior administrative decision, patients with episodic emotional disturbances had been placed in the same ward with epileptics. Witnessing the epileptic seizures and observing Charcot and his students carefully studying their effects, the emotionally disturbed patients started to display similar and even more remarkable symptoms. Same with the multiple personality patients today. Put them in a unit with other patients, they just start copying because they're a bunch of imitating hysterics with false memories. So he's the chief psychiatrist of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. He was also the only psychiatrist appointed to the Catholic Church lay panel on sexual abuse by priests. And his role there was to advise the Catholic Church how to mount a defense based on false memories. So this is like politically alive and well in major criminal and civil lawsuits up until the present, involving hundreds of millions of dollars of settlement by the Catholic Church. And we know, for an objective documented fact, that for many decades, which actually goes all the way back to, I don't know when it goes back to, 600 AD or something, for many decades going back in time, there's very overwhelming documented evidence that when a priest got accused of pedophilia, he was just moved to another location. They moved these people around knowing that the accusations had been made. It did nothing to protect the victims. Most recently, within last year or so, there was a case in Florida that I happened to see on the news where a priest was accused of sexual abuse, and criminal charges were brought against him. And immediately what happened was the priest, who was visiting for 2 years studying from India, was put on a plane and flown back to India. The reason the case came to the attention of the police was another priest came forward and told the police that a parishioner had accused this guy of childhood sexual abuse. The offender priest was whisked out of the country and out of the jurisdiction, so he couldn't be prosecuted. The reporting priest was fired and kicked out of his place of residence and made immediately homeless with no income in the last year or two. This is ongoing to the present. So that's the sordid story of the history of psychiatry and how it treats sexually abused women. With all the authority of institutionalized medicine, we're scientists, we know what's going on, we study hysteria. Not a pretty picture. So let's do 15-minute break. We'll start back at 22, and then I'll get into the trauma dissociation model and how you can use it to integrate and blend together all these different disorders that patients coming to the program have, who are hysterical women with memories of childhood sexual abuse, and have an integrated treatment plan, and kind of make sense of the whole thing. So feel free to ask any questions at any time after we get back. So 22, we'll start back. So just a little clarifying statement. So here we are at a Catholic college, and I appear to have just maliciously attacked the Catholic Church, right? So, which I'm not shy to do, but clearly institutionalized sexual abuse, victimization of women, and pedophilia occur in every institution in our culture. Boy Scouts, universities, psychiatry, general medicine, Masons, Catholics. So there are many, 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 many good people in the world in each of these organizations, including the Catholic Church. Clearly, the behavior of the pedophile and the pedophile protector contingent within the Catholic Church is a complete violation of any decent version of Christianity. So this is not an attack on the Catholic Church as such, but a lot of the behavior of the power hierarchy within the Catholic Church has not been exactly admirable. Same as within medicine, same as within psychiatry. So I wasn't particularly singling out the Catholic Church, but nevertheless, there needs to be a reckoning in all of these institutions in our culture. So that's the history. Anybody with thought, comment, question, feel free to throw up your hand. Now we're going to get into more of the clinical aspect of things. As I mentioned, this is now a model for somebody comes into the program, they got all these different diagnoses, all these problems. How do you approach this clinically? And the foundation is a trauma model, and this is the book that is basically the talk I'm going to give now. By the way, I was highly offended when you said I had 130 papers. That's old news. 200. 200? Yeah, let's get the number right here. So this is Axis 1 comorbidity. So we kind of got rid of the Axis system, but Axis 1 up until DSM-4 was almost all the psychiatric disorders, except for the personality disorders that were on Axis 2. And this is that interview, the SCID, which makes all these different diagnoses. And this is a sample of 103 people in the program with multiple personality disorder in the 90s. And this is the number who have 5, 7, 9, 10, 12 different Axis 1 diagnoses, average being 7 point something. And this structured interview only asks about a relatively small number of all the diagnoses in the DSM. And then we have Axis 2, where the average number of personality disorders per person is 4 point something. So 4 point something plus 7 point something, we're at 12, and the SCID doesn't diagnose the dissociative disorder, the sleep disorder, or the psychosexual disorder, which are all highly prevalent in this population. So we're now pushing up towards an average of 15 different mental disorders lifetime. Not the record holder, the average. This is completely scientifically impossible based on the model of general psychiatry, which is basically we've got the DSM, we've got these different disease, disorder categories, and they're separate things. They may be related a little, but they're basically separate categories. And we got to study this category to find out what's going on here, study that category that's going on there. So, which I'll come back to. But if we look at the basic epidemiology, which is well established in ballpark numbers, this is interviews with thousands of people in all kinds of different countries. Ballparkish overall, about 1% of people will meet criteria of schizophrenia sometime in their lives. So we have numbers for all these disorders. Borderline personality, kind of 2-3-ish%, OCD, somewhere in between 1 and 3%, depression, 10, maybe up to 15%, substance abuse, same sort of range. So we know the frequency of these disorders in the general population. So if they're actually separate independent disorders, we can easily calculate who should have a bunch at the same time. So schizophrenia is 0.01 of the population, multiplied by panic disorder, that's 0.02, equals 0.002 of the population. Multiplied by, now we're going to put into our calculators 15 different diagnoses. 0.01 times 0.02 times 0.03 times 0.01 times 0.1 times 0.03 times 0.1. We've now got more than 10 zeros after the decimal, meaning that there should be statistically less than one person in a trillion, billion on the planet with this much comorbidity. So there should be somewhere between 0 and 7 people on the whole planet who have this much comorbidity, the average for my program, if these are actually separate disorders. So in general medicine, if you've got a sprained ankle, that doesn't mean you're at higher risk for lung cancer. They don't have anything to do with each other. So having one does not increase the risk for the other. The percentage of people who have lung cancer who should have a sprained ankle, it's not, you don't even think about it. So if these are actually independent disorders, just statistically, the number of people who should have 15 is hardly anybody on the whole planet. But we've got, over the years I've been doing this program since 1991, then 98 here, 2000 in LA, we're talking like 15,000 admissions or something. So 15,000 people, some of which are readmissions, so let's say 10,000 people have come through the programs who have an average of this much when there shouldn't be more than a handful at most on the whole planet. This is completely impossible. So there's only two solutions to this problem. Well, there's three. The first solution is ignore it and discredit it, which is basically what organized psychiatry does. The second is just totally ignore it. The second is notice it, but discredit the people. They're a bunch of hysterics, it's not real, they're just acting like they got all this stuff. And the third approach is to go, the whole model just crumbled. So in the theory of scientific revolutions, this is called anomalous data. So you have a dominant paradigm, such as Newtonian physics. Then what happens is you build up a number of observations that just don't fit with the dominant paradigm. So this happens in physics or any area of science. Then the mainstream discredits, ignores it, discredit, ignore, discredit, ignore. And then so much builds up that you have a paradigm crisis. The old theory just cannot accommodate these anomalous observations. And then somebody comes along with a new theory that accommodates all of these anomalous observations and all the predictions of the old theory. So the old theory is like a subset of the new theory, which can account for the anomalous observations. This is a huge paradigm-threatening anomalous observation in psychiatry, that there's this many people with this much comorbidity. The single disease model cannot be scientifically correct unless you totally discredit all these people with hysteria, or you just don't even think about it. So this is a little tiny problem in the way psychiatry operates today. It's either these patients are the hysterics from the Salpêtrière 21st century form, or the entire single disease model is just not reality. We need to throw it out and get a new model, which would be, I think there was a book on a previous slide that had the new model, the trauma model. So how are we going to figure out that all these disorders are all kind of part of the same process and structure? They're not actually independent, separate disorders. So if they're not independent, separate disorders, now we can have some sort of integrated treatment plan. Well, this is what I'm going to talk about. But backing up to medical school, I went to medical school. I learned how to take histories and be a doctor and wear a stethoscope and look at x-rays and stuff. And then I went into psychiatry. So when I go into psychiatry, I'm still a doctor. I have an MD. I'm not wearing a lab coat and I threw my stethoscope away. But I'm still a doctor, and now I study brain diseases, schizophrenia, depression, and so on. There's a few of these hysterics around, but I just kind of ignore them. And what do doctors do? Well, they boss people around and talk like they're the big shots and they own the hospital. They're rude and condescending to the nurses and often to the patients. So I was socialized into that behavior. But I learned that doctors make the diagnosis. In order to make the diagnosis, you take a history, you ask some questions, you do a physical exam, you order some tests, and you come up with a differential diagnosis, which is the short list of what you think it is. And then you narrow that down to the diagnosis. So that's the single disease model. People have a single diagnosis, which in family practice, pediatrics, basically true much of the time. The problem is asthma, the problem is a sprained ankle, the problem is this, that. And the reason you need to make the diagnosis is because diagnosis determines treatment. Because we have different diagnoses. So if you're a family doctor and you just can't figure out, is this a sprained ankle or an ear infection? Okay, so you better change professions, right? The reason it's important to figure that out is the treatments are completely different. Wrapping the ankle with some tape doesn't help the ear infection, and an antibiotic doesn't help the ankle. So in medicine, we actually, most of the time, work a day. The single disease model works, and diagnosis does determine treatment, and we actually have distinct different treatments. If you go to the ICU, it's a totally different story. Now the person's got all kinds of blood pressure problems, infection problems, lung function problems, arrhythmias, liver failure, multiple systems crashing. So the single disease model doesn't apply anymore. And you're doing a lot of different treatments all at the same time. So that's the single disease model. Most of the time it applies and it works. So you go into psychiatry, you're a doctor, the single disease model, diagnosis determines treatment, that's what you do. So you have disorders, diagnoses. How do you know what they are? Well, because you read the DSM. And the DSM is divided up into separate categories. So you go through these checklists and you make the diagnosis. And that's important because we have different diagnoses. Like we have psychosis. And for psychosis, we give, what do we give again? Help me out. Oh, antipsychotics, that's it. It's kind of hard to remember. If the diagnosis is depression, what do we give? Antidepressants. If the diagnosis is anxiety, we give anti-anxiety meds or anxiolytics. So if the diagnosis is bipolar, where your mood goes up and down, we give mood stabilizers. So we have diagnostic categories, and we have drugs, and the names match. And you got to figure out which is which. This is the way you get taught. So then you walk into, that's in the ivory tower, then you walk into the real world of an inpatient unit, which I did as a medical student, then did as a resident. Lo and behold, what do you actually see? You don't see anybody who's on one psych med. And when you look in their chart, you see, oh, well, right now they have the diagnosis of schizophrenia. But 2 admissions ago, they had, back when I was a resident, it was manic depressive illness. Now it's bipolar disorder. And then over this time, they were called antisocial personality disorder. So you see all these different diagnoses. And the thicker the chart and the greater the number of admissions, the more past diagnoses. And then you've got different treatments depending on what the diagnosis is. So, okay, well, so which one's correct? What's going on here? And then when you look at the list of medications, okay, this person has schizophrenia, so they're on an antipsychotic, but these days they're also on a mood stabilizer and an SSRI antidepressant. Okay, this person has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, they're on a mood stabilizer, an SSRI, and an antipsychotic. So it's bipolar disorder, it's schizophrenia, but it's the same collection of meds. Frequently, not once in a while. So the DSM diagnosis, the single leading diagnosis, is only having a minor effect on the prescribing patterns. And the names of the different meds don't all fit the so-called the diagnosis. This is what actually happens in psychopharmacology. So the single disease model and diagnosis determined treatment, everybody talks that way and makes diagnoses and pretends that this model applies, but it's not what's actually going on in the reality of inpatient psychopharmacology or anywhere where you're dealing with severely disturbed individuals. They don't just fit a single disease, and they're not just on one med. So the whole model isn't really how reality actually operates, because people have lots and lots of comorbidity. So the prescriber goes, okay, this is the diagnosis, but, well, they also have these symptoms, so I'll give this for this symptom. Oh, trouble sleeping. Oh, pain. Oh, oh, depression. And you end up with a benzodiazepine, maybe a narcotic, one SSRI, maybe two antipsychotics, a mood stabilizer. This is routine and common. It's not an exception. It's routine and common. So the single disease model, diagnosis determines treatment, we have specific treatments for specific disorders, is just not reality. It's not how psychiatry actually operates. But nevertheless, we read the DSM. Now I decided I want to be an expert on eating disorders, but I feel like incompetent. So what do I have to do? I should read a journal that's got a title like the Journal of Eating Disorders. I should read a book that's got eating disorders or anorexia or bulimia in the title. I should go to a conference that is eating disorders conference. I should listen to the experts on eating disorders who all know each other, publish in the same journals, approve each other's grants. Okay, now finally I'm like marginally competent for treating eating disorders. I know nothing about borderline personality disorder. So now I gotta go read the Journal of Personality Disorders, find about dialectical behavior therapy, go to a DBT conference, get trained in DBT. Now I sort of know what's going on with borderline personality disorder, but geez, somebody comes in with post-traumatic stress disorder. So on and on it goes. We've got these little fiefdoms with these groups of experts with their own sections of the DSM, with their own grants, their own journals, their own in-club, their own friendships. And the guys in the PTSD club do not talk to the guys in the autism club. It's totally separate clubs that don't communicate with each other at all. This is the way the whole mental health field is organized. But it's not how reality is organized. If you look at the genetic research these days, which is a monumental waste of billions and billions and billions of dollars. So in the DSM-5, it says, and this is after half a decade of biological research, really a century, because there was biological psychiatry research in the late 19th century. It says, this is not my personal opinion, this is the official position of the National Institute of Mental Health and the American Psychiatric Association. There is no biological test of any kind that helps you make any clinical diagnosis of any kind throughout the entire DSM. That's what it says in the DSM-5. So all these billions and billions, we might even be at trillions by now in half a century, of research on biological psychiatry, mostly genetics, has yielded absolutely zero of any practical use in the treatment of any single human being ever. This is the yield. Oh, but we need to keep funding, keep funding, keep funding. So now we're into what's called genome-wide association studies. And we're spending all these bazillions of dollars, and we're having studies published that are like 30,000, 35,000 people with schizophrenia, 30,000 controls without schizophrenia. We've done a whole genome-wide analysis because we have these machines that do it quickly now. And so there's 23,000 or something genes roughly. We have no idea what we're looking for. The computer just grinds and grinds and grinds and grinds and finds one gene somewhere where there's a specific mutation a little bit more frequently than there is in the controls. And we go, oh, we found something. And one of these papers, I wrote a commentary on it called extreme exaggeration of research in schizophrenia genetics. So this was published in Nature magazine, top science magazine in the world, along with Science. Professors from Harvard, big article in the New York Times, press coverage all over the world, this fundamental breakthrough in studying the biology of schizophrenia. Finally, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. And commentators, top professors, are saying, this is the first time we've really started to get down to what's going on in schizophrenia, which can potentially lead to some revolutionary treatments. What was the finding? The finding is there's a specific gene, which is the C4 complement gene, which previously nobody thought had anything to do with psychiatry. But statistically, it pops up in the computer. And it turns out that this gene has something to do with regulating what's going on in the brain. So they're, whoa, it's something that's going on in the brain. We're really getting to it now. If you have this gene, your risk for developing schizophrenia goes up from 1% to 1.27%. That's it. That's this revolutionary finding that we had to have like 30,000+ patients and 30,000 controls. You imagine how much that cost? And all the organization published in the top journal. And so when you go back to the DSM-5, what does it say about genetics? It says there's at least several hundred identified risk genes for mental disorders, and it's the same group of genes for schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, autism, and ADHD. It's not different genes for different disorders. According to the research in the American Psychiatric Association, there's no genetic specificity to any psychiatric disorders. And it says in the DSM, which is just a summary of the research, there's hundreds of genes contributing risk. Each of these genes by itself contributes 1% to 2% to the risk, which 1.27 fits right in that range. So that means if each gene is contributing 1% to 2%, there's somewhere between 50 and 100 genes contributing to the risk for schizophrenia. Which means if we're going to treat this biology, we have to develop 50 to 100 designer drugs targeting the specific gene mechanism. So, and each of these drugs is going to cost what, $5,000, $10,000 a month? And people with schizophrenia are going to be taking 50 to 100 of these drugs? And who's going to pay for this? And how many side effects? And how many drug-drug interactions there are going to be? The whole thing is completely scientifically preposterous. Completely guaranteed never to yield any real findings. It's absolutely scientifically impossible. If there's hundreds of risk genes, have no diagnostic specificity, and you're going to develop designer drugs to target even half of them, nobody's going to pay for that. It's completely impossible. Nobody's going to take that many pills. There's going to be so many side effects and drug-drug interactions. It's just, stop. There's no chance that this is going anywhere. But that's where all the big money, all the best prestige, all the publications are. So welcome to biological psychiatry in its current form. It's so absurd and so impossible that you would think that it cannot possibly be happening on this planet, except for the fact that it is happening and it dominates the field. Just like you'd never think that 100 years ago, doctors were fumigating the vaginas of their patients and digitally raping them as a treatment. You would think, no, that never happened. But it did. Mainstream top people were endorsing it. Okay, so what are you going to do then? You're going to look at the dissociative structural model, which, as it explains at the bottom, is a structural, not an etiological model. Etiology means cause. So this is about a postulated internal psychological structure that goes all the way back to Janet. So the people who developed this structural dissociation theory talk about Janet all the time. It's fragmentation of the psyche in response to trauma. And I'm going to use this model to tie a bunch of disorders together. So first of all, we're going to talk about dissociated compartments. So there's all these different schools of psychiatry, of psychology, of psychotherapy. There's these people and these people, these beliefs and this beliefs. And they have their own theories and their own experts and their own journals and their own conferences. and their own vocabulary. So the basic idea here is that the psyche in a healthy person, reasonably healthy, is integrated. It's kind of fluid, it's flexible, your feelings are fit with your thoughts, which fits with your behaviors. You don't just all of a sudden change to some totally different behavior and tell the person that they're overreacting if they say they're a little disturbed by your behavior. You're sort of consistent, you're flexible, you can act in different ways. That's a healthy, integrated psyche. In the unhealthy psyche, it's fragmented into bits or pieces or compartments. And this is basically a theory throughout the mental health field. A lot of the theories never use the word dissociation. A lot of them don't talk much about trauma, but they're all talking about these compartments that are separate from each other, and there's not a fluid, flexible flow of information back and forth. So in the Freudian literature, these would be called part-object identifications or part selves. There's a school of therapy that's sort of like everybody has a minor version of dissociative identity disorder school of therapy called ego state therapy, where the compartments are called ego states. In the multiple personality literature, these compartments are called alter personalities or identity states. If you go to MIT and you talk to these serious science people, they don't talk about clinical stuff or Freud or anybody because they're scientists. So they talk about modules. The brain is modular in its organization, brain-mind. It's not just one system, it's composed of subsystems. So memory, we can divide into two major subsystems: declarative, procedural, conscious, unconscious, explicit, implicit memory. There's no dispute about this in psychology, experimental psychology. There's bazillions of experiments on all kinds of species. Memory is composed of these two major subsystems, declarative and procedural memory. You can knock one out and the other can still be functioning. All totally proven. So therefore, normal memory is composed of two submodules, procedural, declarative memory. And then you can have sub-submodules and all kinds of different brain functions. So this is just simply not disputed. It's just the way it is in the brain and the mind. In the multiple personality literature, these compartments or modules are personified and elaborated to the greatest degree. So each compartment, or a fair number of the compartments, have a different name, a different age, different hair color, different gender. So they're, quotes, different people. In fact, there's only one person there. This is an internal psychological reality. It's not a literal fact that there's actually a whole bunch of people in there. And so when I'm explaining this to patients who are very invested in it's very literally real, I explain, okay, this is the central paradox of DID. It's a term I coined. The central paradox of DID is it's perfectly real and it's not real at all. And both things are true. So what do I mean by that? This is before everybody rushes to the door and says, I'm going to leave because you're out of your mind, Dr. Ross. Okay, so what I mean by it's not literally concretely true that there's different people living inside is if we took an x-ray of your head, we wouldn't see all these little skeletons in there. And everybody goes, oh, little skeletons. Well, that's true. Nobody says, yeah, there would be a bunch of skeletons in there. So everybody agrees there's not literally these little bodies inside the brain running around, because those bones would be tearing up the brain for one thing. So it's not literally concretely real. But on the other hand, it's completely psychologically real. The people really do come to, like if you have DID and you're listening to the lecture, all of a sudden it's tomorrow afternoon and you're in East Lansing and you don't know how you got there. No, that's an experience that people actually have. Or they open their closet and there's a whole bunch of like hooker style outfits that were just bought yesterday. They have a blank spell from noon to 4 p.m. and there's the receipt. It's their credit card. It sort of looks like their signature, but not exactly. So these are not everyday experiences most people have. This is dissociative identity disorder. This is the alters coming out and doing things. It's really psychologically real. It's just not literally real. So that's the central paradox of DID. And the other thing that happens with DID is you have these different people and you have switching. So Dr. Ross is here talking, and then all of a sudden little 6-year-old Bobby's here talking. He's all scared, or he wants to play, or he talks like a little kid. Then Bobby goes back inside and Dr. Ross is like, sorry, I must have zoned out for a minute. No memory of Bobby talking at all. So full switching and full amnesia. And then there's all kinds of degrees of that. It can be sort of a full switch, not exactly. It can be sort of full amnesia, maybe kind of half. Maybe it's kind of cloudy. Or you can have a full switch with no amnesia at all. So Dr. Ross is just sitting there, oh geez, there's Bobby talking again. Dr. Ross is kind of a little bit back there watching and observing, but he hasn't gone, he doesn't have amnesia. But the classical hallmark, which people with DID have, is this full switch with full amnesia, at least some of the time. So that's the picture of DID that everybody agrees on. So the people who believe in DID say, yeah, that's the picture. The people who don't believe in DID say, yeah, that's the picture, I just don't believe in it. But nobody disputes, that's what we're talking about. So that's DID. But actually, most of the symptoms, even in full DID, do not come from a full switch and full amnesia. They come from intrusions and withdrawals. So what you have is a wounded inner child in the simplest version of the model, and that inner child is holding a feeling, a memory, a thought, and there's a trigger, or something happens, all of a sudden the memory, the visual picture, whatever elements of the trauma come flooding up, so that's an intrusion. Or you put it so far on the back burner that it's pushed down there into the underground world, where it's stored for a while until it intrudes. So two separate ego states. There's the apparently normal personality, the ANP, in the vocabulary of this book, which is the book about structural dissociation. And there's the emotional personality. So that's the adult persona and the wounded inner child. And sometimes feelings come up from the child, sometimes they're stuffed back down. So I'm going to take that model and I'm going to kind of scale it down half, 2/3. So it's not full DID, it's not full personality states that have names and ages and everything, but it's a bunch of modules or compartments that are pretty disconnected and disjointed. One could have a full alter personality in it. One could just have a feeling. One could have a memory. One could have an impulse. So this is my modification of these guys' theory, who are colleagues of mine, who I know personally. So instead of requiring an EP, which is an inner child that has a subjective sense of being a child, being a separate self, having a name, having an age, instead of you have to have that to have structural dissociation, I say, sure, a lot of time that's true, but sometimes there isn't really a formed inner child there. There's just another compartment holding a feeling or a thought or a memory. So therefore, we've broadened your theory and made it applicable to all kinds of things in DSM. And they go, no, no, that's not the way the theory is. So I'm having trouble talking them into agreeing. But usually when I talk to therapists, they all go, well, that makes sense. Even therapists who don't treat dissociative identity disorder. So that's the basic visual picture. Up in the light of day is the apparently normal personality. Down in the underground compartment is the wounded child. And now I'm going to walk through, I guess one of these years I should probably put DSM-5 up there. But I'm going to walk through this set of diagnoses here, which is just a sample, and present an argument for why they all fit this structural dissociation. The adult self, the wounded inner child. In DID, there can be a bunch of adults and a bunch of children. But the basic model is adults, persona, wounded inner child, intrusions, withdrawals. So if this doesn't apply to dissociative identity disorder, I just need to give up, go home, and retire. If dissociative identity disorder isn't based on structural dissociation with different people inside, there's nothing more to talk about. We're totally lost. So I'll just take that as a given, and now I'll talk about PTSD, which is called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But for making a point, I'm going to say we could rename it bipolar trauma disorder. So bipolar used to be bipolar mood disorder, now it's just bipolar disorder in DSM-5. You go up into mania, down into depression, so it's bipolar. That's hence the name. So I'm saying that it's the same thing with PTSD. There's an up pole and a down pole. And the up pole, all of this is in the entire PTSD literature. It's in the diagnostic criteria. It's in all the measures. The up pole is the hyper alert, startle, danger, scared, flashbacks, nightmares. And along with that, clearly, we're talking about adrenaline, sympathetic nervous system overdrive, fight, flight. So there's no expert in PTSD who disputes this point. They just don't usually call it the up pole and the down pole. The down pole is also in the diagnostic criteria, also in the literature, and can be horrendously disabling. I just worked with a person this morning she's got an interrelated set of problems, but the deepest core problem is the down pole of PTSD. So that's numbing, denial, amnesia, avoidance, withdrawal. That's the shutdown. And it's actually a much more complicated picture, but just so we can sort of have some sort of grasp on a model. Now we're mostly talking the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, and we're talking freeze response. Actually, in fact, you can have a frozen fear state where your adrenaline is up, your pulse is up, you're frightened, you're terrified, you're overwhelmed, but you're not moving, you're catatonic. So you can have all kinds of mixed states. It's not quite so simple. But generally, overall, most of the time, we can look at it as the up pole and the down pole. All the diagnostic criteria, nobody disputes it. Okay, so that's fine. What on earth has that got to do with structural dissociation? A little tour through the history of the DSM. PTSD came into the DSM-3 in 1980. So it didn't exist, that term wasn't in the DSM-2. If we go all the way back to First World War, it was called shell shock. And the elite of the British military said that we are not allowed to talk about shell shock. So people would be like fined, imprisoned, demoted if they even talked about shell shock. It doesn't exist, we're not going there. If you go back to the 19th century, it was called railway spine, which was railway workers who had injuries had PTSD. So it's existed under a series of names, but it became PTSD for the first time officially in 1980. And the people who did the research and got organized and did the lobbying of the DSM were mostly psychologists and some psychiatrists working in the VA system with Vietnam vets. That's where PTSD came from. So it's defined as, excuse me, there has to be this big traumatic event. You have to have an immediate reaction of fear, terror, power, helplessness. And then for a month or longer, you have to have the symptoms, which are the up pole, down pole symptoms. And the event has to be life-threatening or cause physical injury. And so this created a problem because when drug companies started trying to find a medication that was good for PTSD, they got Zoloft approved by the FDA, which barely does anything at all. But in order to recruit enough people for the drug study, they included many dozens of women whose trauma was childhood sexual abuse. That was kind of fudging it, because some sexual abuse is very violent and threatening, and people are bleeding and so on, like our patient at the Salpetria was. But oftentimes there's no threat to life or limb or physical injury. So it doesn't technically meet the criteria for PTSD. So what happened in DSM-4 was the event criteria was expanded. Now in DSM-5 it says the type of traumatic event can include sexual abuse. Also, the symptom criteria have been expanded from 3 to 4 to 5, and they now include anger, negative beliefs about the self, the world, the future, irritability, there's substance abuse problems in there, and dissociative symptoms. So that's good. So the picture of PTSD is no longer just PTSD. So in effect, PTSD is only one part of PTSD. Instead of you have PTSD and comorbid depression, depression is now part of the PTSD itself. So the whole DSM system is kind of painfully slowly just getting to what I'm describing here. Okay, so that still doesn't tell us what does PTSD have to do with structural dissociation. Well, PTSD used to be an anxiety disorder in DSM-3, was an anxiety disorder in DSM-4, 1994, now is in its own category called trauma and stressor-related disorders, which is right beside the dissociative disorders. And it says in the DSM, we're putting things side by side if they're closely related to each other. So who thinks that, this is a rhetorical question, who thinks that flashbacks are a minor, peripheral, occasional symptom in PTSD? Nobody. Everybody thinks that flashbacks are a major core symptom, if not the major core symptom. And what are these called in DSM-3, 4, and 5? They're called dissociative flashback episodes. So going back to DSM-3, if it's an anxiety disorder, why is the core symptom a dissociative flashback episode? Makes no sense whatsoever. So this is just a sort of discombobulated, jumbled up mess that the whole DSM system still is. But let's just go with that. Okay, dissociative flashback episodes are a core symptom of PTSD. Whether we call it an anxiety disorder or trauma or stressor-related disorder. Whether it's far away from the dissociative disorders or right beside. Okay, so flashbacks are a core symptom of PTSD. Okay, let's just take a look at that word. Flashbacks. Something can't flash back if it's already with you. It has to be somewhere else to flash back. And a flashback is, it feels involuntary, it's a sudden intrusion, it comes out of nowhere, there's a trigger, and you get flooded with that material. And then you either ignore it, get drunk, go to sleep, distract yourself, and you push it back down. So that's the withdrawal symptom. That's what PTSD is. So you couldn't have PTSD without structural dissociation. There has to be feelings, memories, pictures stored in another compartment that suddenly intrude in. Otherwise, you cannot have the symptom of a flashback. Therefore, you cannot have PTSD without structural dissociation. I can't see the flaw in the argument. Like, how is that not true and not possible, just logically, without doing any research at all? So what's the classical picture, going back to DSM-3? There's the Vietnam vet, he's in his backyard barbecuing, it's years later, everything's okay, he's calm, he flips the burger. All of a sudden, the news helicopter goes overhead. Completely flooded, he's back in Vietnam, he hears it, he sees it, he smells it, he dives under the hedge, he's totally disoriented. Everybody's got to calm him down, let him know it's okay. So the news helicopter is not a threat in the present. It's a trigger. He's having a hysterical overreaction. He's being dramatic and attention-seeking. Well, we don't say that about him because he's a former Navy SEAL tough guy. We say, no, he's got PTSD. This is a trigger. The reaction is completely out of proportion to the reality of the present, but it's completely in proportion to the reality of the past. It's just out of context, it's been triggered. And it's flashed back, therefore we're at structural dissociation. So if we talk about current vets coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, we can divide them into 3 groups, which you actually see clinically, or we see in life. People who have obvious PTSD. These are the guys that get diagnosed. So according to the VA, 20% of returning deployed service members have PTSD. That's their statistic, which we know for sure has to be an underestimate, but it's no less than 20%. According to the VA, the leading cause of PTSD in returning female service members is rape by US military people. That's according to the VA. The primary cause of PTSD is rape by other military members. The statistic for rape on campus currently is the risk of being raped during 4 years of undergraduate work for a female is 25%. Of those, 83% occur in the context of the woman being intoxicated. These are the basic statistics that are just out there and accepted. That's the official word on things. So this is monstrous, mammoth problem, not just in the 19th century, but now. So those people have up-pull PTSD. They're having flashbacks, nightmares, getting triggered, combat. They're easy to diagnose. Then we have the people who somehow, by some miracle, don't actually have PTSD, despite combat exposure. Then we have this third group. So the first group is bipolar PTSD. They go up and down. They have flashbacks, it's hyperarousal, they numb out. The unipolar, they only have one pole. So unipolar depression means you only go down into depression. Bipolar means you also go up into mania. If we call this bipolar mood disorder, they only have the unipolar down pole. They're always numbed out, always shut down. What did the person I was working with today say? Not a combat vet. It's like my soul is dead. It's like I'm gone. I feel like I'm not here anymore. What do the family members say when the guy comes back from combat? His body's walking around talking to us, but he never came back. The guy who left did not come back because the essential spirit has been numbed out, shut down, hidden in that underground compartment. These are the downpole guys. So they don't look like they have PTSD. They're not having flashbacks, nightmares, or anything, but they actually have an even more severe PTSD. And when those guys blow, that's when there's a murder-suicide. So that's why PTSD fits the model. How about obsessive-compulsive disorder? That also used to be an anxiety disorder in DSM-3. 4, now is its own group of obsessive-compulsive and related disorders. What's the definition of OCD? Well, you have obsessions and compulsions. The obsessions are the thinking, the compulsions are the behavior. So you have to have either thinking or behavior. But everybody, whether you're a biological psychiatrist, cognitive, Freudian, doesn't matter. In order to have OCD, a couple things have to be true. There's a frequency criterion. So I've met people who wash their hands with not necessarily caustic soda, but pretty heavy-duty stuff 100 or more times a day, and there's like a red line right here, and their hands are red. Or people who have to check the locks on their doors 3 times, and they have to do 3 sets of 3. They can't do 7 or 8, they have to do 3 sets of 3. They have to check the locks, then they have to check the stove, then they have to check several other things, then they have to count their jewelry before they can even go to bed every night. So you have to have some sort of frequency. You have to do it a bunch. You can't have a hand-washing form of OCD because you wash your hands twice a day. It's not often enough. So there's frequency. The other main criterion is it has to be ego alien. It has to be an intrusion from somewhere else. It's not just, I think I'll have a sip of water, excuse me. Why was that not a water-sipping form of OCD? Well, because I just thought I'll have a sip of water. There wasn't this compulsion that intruded in and I had to fight against it and try and push it down, and it intruded even more, and I pushed it down and I got more and more anxious, and then I sipped some water, and then I was okay for a little bit. And then the anxiety started coming up again. That's what OCD is. It's this ego alien, not coming from me, obsession or compulsion that intrudes in, you try and fight it and push it down, it intrudes in, you get more and more anxious, you do the behavior, and you get temporary relief. Whether it's a genetic or a brain chemical or a psychodynamic, doesn't matter what the model is, that's OCD. Everybody's agreed, so my argument is it's the same thing. You can't have this compulsive intrusion if it's not intruding from somewhere else. If it's just you, it's just you. So therefore, logically, you cannot have OCD without structural dissociation in place, no matter what category of the manual you put it in. I'll skip a little bit of this, but I remember when I was a resident, I'm being taught about OCD. Little quick mention of magical thinking in OCD, and then we never talked about it again. It had nothing to do with treatment. It was just in the textbook, gone, nobody thought about it. So I filed it in the filing cabinet here with the creaky drawers that are a little rusty. And then a little later I pulled it out and said, wait a minute, why is obsessive compulsive disorder magical thinking? What's that got to do with anything? Well, let's go to structural dissociation. There's the apparently normal personality, and there's the emotional personality, which is the wounded child. There may have been overt, clear trauma, or there may not. This is a structural model, not an etiological model. There can be any cause under the sun that you can imagine. In order for the model to apply, there has to be this structure in place. In principle, it could be caused by genes, could be caused by anything you can imagine. Quite a bit of the time caused by trauma, not necessarily, not all the time. Sometimes it's family dynamics, family dysfunction, sometimes it's just your temperament, maybe sometimes it's a panda infection when you're a kid. Zillion different possible causes. But you can't have you can't have OCD without structural dissociation, which means you've got some degree of a formed inner child in there who's scared and anxious. I don't know if they told you that you have to pass the exam in order to get any course credit this year. The exam that I'm going to give you right now. Did you know that? Oh, by the way, it appears that from the latest biological research involving fMRIs and genome-wide analysis, that there's a certain dysregulation in the brain in that the normal dampening functions of the medial frontal temporal lobe are not quite functioning properly, and the normal regulatory processes between the cortex and the limbic system are not working, causing sudden intrusions from the limbic system. Okay, that was role play number 1. I'm going to do role play number 2 now. And the quiz is, which was the apparently normal adult self-talking and which is the emotional personality? Okay, so now watch closely. Oh my God, my hand's all germs, oh, like it's a... That's... Which one do you think is a scared, overwhelmed child who's doing magical thinking? So OCD is totally all magical thinking by a scared, overwhelmed child. Oh, God, I'll never be able to finish this lecture with this. Whew. Okay. Of course, now the chair, geez. Okay, this is just magical thinking. It's not objective reality, grown-up thinking. That's everything in OCD is like that. So it totally fits the structural dissociation model. Why is there magical thinking in OCD? It's all magical thinking intruding in from that other compartment. Well, what are we going to do about theory and treatment? So you can go to the brain disease model of OCD conference and listen to them talking. You're not hearing nothing about trauma, nothing about dissociation, nothing about wounded inner children, nothing about wishy-washy, touchy-feely psychotherapy, because these are scientists. But they're talking about brain subsystems that are not integrated, that are not communicating with each other and regulating each other in a normal fashion. It's a completely dissociative structural model, just in brain system vocabulary. And so they'll poo-poo the reality of dissociation while basically, unavoidably, they have to talk about a structural dissociation model in brain terms, otherwise the symptoms can't exist. Same thing if you go to the cognitive behavioral literature. Hardcore cognitive behavioral people are pretty rigid and pretty full of themselves and think that they're the way to go and they're by far the kings of the psychotherapy field. Actually, in fact, neither medications nor cognitive behavioral therapy work that well for OCD. But if you have a treatment responder for medications, which is a biological model, what happens? You stop having obsessions and compulsions. You're a treatment responder. But what does everybody in that literature say? Stay on your meds. If you stop your meds, you're going to relapse. And then they have research and shows people relapse. Because all the meds do is they just seal over the symptoms. Nobody anywhere makes any other claim about psychopharmacology. No psych med for any disorder cures anything. It just suppresses the symptoms. If they are suppressed, you're a responder. So in this model, this dissociative structural model, if somebody responds to Prozac or whatever for OCD, which is a small number of people, we're good to go. That stupid inner child Brad is not bothering us anymore. We're not hearing from him. We've suppressed him. You stop the meds, now the inner child comes back and all this magical thinking. So all we're doing here is suppressing a part of the psyche. disconnecting it, dissociating it better so there's no intrusions. And we call that a symptom response. Or if we're in hardcore mainstream cognitive behavioral therapy, how do they talk about things? They don't talk about trauma, don't talk about wounded inner child, don't talk about dissociation. They use techniques like cognitive distancing, response prevention. The whole vocabulary and tone is, we're not buying into that, we're not responding to that, we're ignoring it, it'll go away. Because children are better neither seen nor heard. So these are all suppression-based models from which, so in practical terms, somebody might be a responder. Okay, good. Most people are not. But from these suppression-based models, which is all of psychopharmacology, there's no possibility of healing, recovery, or cure. Even in theory, for there to be healing, recovery, and cure, from the point of view of structural dissociation, you have to do an integration-based model. You have to somehow acknowledge the existence of this wounded inner child, try and figure out how it got there, which you may not be able to figure out, accept it, own it, do internal self-soothing, mastering, owning, accepting, soothing, and the inner child gets integrated together into you. The scared aspect melts away because it's integrated with an adult self, and you don't have the symptoms anymore. Now, so it's a whole research thing to find out if that actually works or not, but at least there's a possibility of recovery. So I'm going to walk fairly quickly, but we're not out of time, through a few more disorders. The impulse control disorders, which in DSM-3 and 4 included, so a totally different section in the manual. In DSM-3 and 4 it included trichotillomania, which is where you pluck hairs out of your head. And some people have significant bald patches. So this was an impulse control disorder up until DSM-4 in 1994. So the reason you did that is you had an impulse to do a repetitive behavior. And that impulse intruded in from somewhere else. Whereas if you have an impulse to line things up and check things, that's not an impulse, that's a compulsion, because that's a form of OCD. So when you repetitively do a behavior that's ego alien and intrusive, that's an obsession or a compulsion, with one exception. If it's plucking hair, that's not a compulsion, that's an impulse. So you see the difference? There's no difference. It's completely arbitrary. So finally in DSM-5, they moved trichotillomania in to be another form of OCD. But this just illustrates kind of the arbitrary nature of the whole system and the political and historical forces that shape it and how we keep trying to update it and we never get there. But that's irrelevant because the main impulse control disorder is intermittent explosive disorder, which is intermittently you explode in a rage. Out of context, out of proportion, which has absolutely nothing to do with PTSD. So a guy flies into a rage and beats up his wife, which is a very common form of intermittent explosive disorder, which could be a biological brain disease. Maybe his brain's just making him do that. But most of the time, this is a guy with a huge anger management problem. So when does he fly into a rage and beat his wife up? Strangely, never in front of the police station. Right? So, I mean, this isn't a random event. This is not actually like a seizure that just happens anywhere. And he's careful not to do it in front of the police or in front of his brother-in-law who happens to be holding a shotgun. So there's a situation. There's a time and a place when it does happen, a time and a place when it doesn't happen. Well, so he comes home, hard day at work, it's Friday night, kids are off at the babysitter, candles are on the table, glasses of wine, time to beat up the wife? Well, no, he's not going to beat his wife up then. He's going to be thrilled. He comes home and the wife is like, oh my God, look at that Brad Pitt. Oh, well, that might be a reason she needs to be beaten up. So the behavior is fly into a rage and beat up the wife or the girlfriend. What's the threat? He doesn't say, oh, there's a news helicopter, I better go beat up my wife. That doesn't have anything to do with anything. The threat is real or perceived or imagined abandonment by your primary female attachment figure equals your wife or girlfriend. So why is he having that reaction? Because of combat? Because he was in a car accident? Because he got mugged? No. What's the antecedent trauma? The antecedent trauma is real or perceived threatened abandonment by your primary female attachment figure equals mom. So there's a little scared child inside this guy who's now got a big body with too much testosterone. The little child goes, Mommy wasn't there for me, I was emotionally neglected, I was abandoned, I felt really small and scared and sad, and I might even die. And now he's living inside this female body. The trigger is, what's that woman's name again? Mommy? No, wife. Wife is going to leave me. She doesn't care about me. She doesn't find me attractive. She's more interested in him. I'm going to be abandoned. I feel small, scared. Up comes the rage to take care of business. Because now we're not a little 5-year-old. We're a big guy who can take care of business. Beats up the wife. She ain't going nowhere. Whew, problem solved. So it's a completely different section of the manual, completely different disorder, different experts, has nothing to do with PTSD, except for the fact it's exactly the same thing as PTSD. It's a different type of trauma. What comes flooding up is not a combat scene. It's that feeling of small, scared, abandoned, and then all the rage at mom for abandoning me, and now I've got the strength to do something about it. What's the treatment going to be? It's going to be the same type of treatment as we do for PTSD. What happened? What's the story? Why do you feel this way? Why would anybody feel that way? Anybody would. Now you've got this wounded, scared inner child, and all you're doing is flying into a rage to protect him, but that's going to drive your wife away and you're going to end up divorced. It's not working for you. Maybe the problem's not your wife. Maybe the problem's your feelings inside, your own insecurity. Oh, okay, now we're off on a treatment that's going to be the same basically as the treatment for PTSD or obsessive compulsive disorder. Borderline personality disorder. About 60% of people come to our program meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. I was taught to have the same attitude towards people with borderline personality disorder as Charcot had towards the grand hysterics. It's just a morphed 20th, 21st century version of grand hysteria. It's a bunch of women, they're all over the map, they do crazy stuff for no good reason. They're always trying to get your attention, they're seductive, and you have to kind of push them away because otherwise they'll get dependent, and you know what happened with hysterics when they got into the Salpêtrière. That's what I was taught. Very demeaning, belittling, dismissing, chauvinist. They're not legitimate patients. And when you look in the sexual misconduct literature, sexual misconduct by physicians of all kinds, social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, who thinks, another multiple choice quiz question here, who thinks the most common dyad for sexual misconduct by a professional is a 25-year-old medical student and an 83-year-old demented woman in a nursing home? It's not going to happen, right? What's the most common dyad? It's a middle-aged male psychiatrist, social worker, psychologist, and a hot young female borderline. Is this very hard to figure out? Why is this guy abusing the hot young borderline and not the 83-year-old demented woman? It's the same thing as what was going on at the Salpêtrière. At the Salpêtrière, some of those grand hysterics were having sex with the interns, and one of them lived with an intern in between admissions as his sexual partner. So there's a lot of sex going on, not just this digital rape stuff. Same thing's going on here in the 21st century. And I was socialized to have the same sort of attitude towards borderlines. And if I went through the symptoms one by one, I would make a pretty compelling argument for they all fit the structural dissociation model. They're the grand hysterics, the witches of the present. They're all just a bunch of trauma victims with understandable symptoms. So dissociative schizophrenia, so I wrote this book on schizophrenia. Same argument now, which applies only to a subgroup of people with schizophrenia, not all cases. Because schizophrenia is this category that we just throw a whole bunch of things into because we can't sort them out and separate them. So everybody in psychiatry agrees that schizophrenia is not one thing. It's just sort of a holding category for a whole bunch of stuff we haven't sorted out yet. And there's clearly symptom subgroups. So some people with schizophrenia don't even hear voices. But voices, just like flashbacks are to PTSD, voices are to schizophrenia. They're a core major symptom that dominates the literature, and everybody agrees on that point. Even though not everybody with schizophrenia has auditory hallucinations, voices, just like you can meet the other criteria for PTSD, and enough of them to have PTSD without flashbacks. But most people with PTSD have flashbacks, most people with schizophrenia have voices, and in the DSM 3 and 4, it says there's basically the symptoms, which is criterion A, a list of symptoms. Criterion B is it has to last 6 months. C is there has to be distress, dysfunction, deterioration. And the other criteria can't be better explained by some other disorder or illness. So basically schizophrenia is symptoms that last for 6 months or longer with distress, deterioration, and function. What's the list of symptoms? It's surprisingly short, and there's a little note. It actually says note, colon, only one symptom is required if it consists of voices talking to each other or voices keeping up a running commentary on the person's behavior. This is DSM 3 and 4. And the literature going all the way back to Bloyler's, voices, voices, voices. So it's the same logic again. In order to be an auditory hallucination, a voice, what has to be going on? Okay, why didn't I just hear a voice talking to me? Well, because I didn't hear any voice, but I was thinking. And what were the qualities of those thoughts? They were quiet. So to be an auditory hallucination, it has to be relatively loud. You can't have a voice that's so quiet that you can't even hear it, then it's just inaudible. So voices have volume. They could have really big volume or kind of medium volume. But if you scale the volume down, it starts to get very hard to tell, is this a thought or a slightly noisy thought, or do I call this a voice? So there's a volume. Just like in OCD, there's frequency, but here there's volume. But the other criterion is it has to be ego alien. It can't feel like it's you talking to yourself, which everybody does. It has to feel like it's coming from somewhere else. It's intruding into you from somewhere else. It's not originating with you. You can't turn the voice on. You can't turn it off. You can't control the content. And dang, if the voices don't talk to each other, and you're just a third party listening. This is the way voices are defined. And everybody agrees, whether they're biological people, genetic people, it doesn't matter. You cannot have, so if it's actually coming from the wall, that's a different story. But if it's actually originating inside your brain, and it's intruding in, and you don't feel like it's coming from you, and you're not controlling the content, it has to be a dissociated thing coming from another compartment of your psyche. Otherwise, the symptom can't take place. And these are not just voices, which some people have. These are voices that keep up a running commentary on the person's behavior and talk to each other in sentences and paragraphs. So they're like little TV commentators inside the person's head. Oh, she's doing this. Now she's doing that. Oh, watch that. No, that's not true. Stop saying that about her. Or do this, do that, kill yourself. You're no good. You're dirty. You're bad. You're an idiot. This is what goes on in the minds of people with schizophrenia. Out loud voices that comment on the person's behavior. So they have attitudes, they have perceptions, they have opinions, they have recommendations that they make, they squabble with each other, they speak in sentences and paragraphs. So this is not two neurons on the fritz. This is quite a big chunk of brain-mind network real estate to have perceptions, attitudes, feelings, comments, opinions, speak in sentences and paragraphs. So that's sort of like an alter personality. That's like another person inside talking to you, which is clearly just a dissociated part of yourself.
Why do you not call that a conscious being or conscious entity?
I do, but the schizophrenia field doesn't. The schizophrenia field just goes, brain's on the fritz, having voices, give them meds. It doesn't even think about it beyond that point, literally. So you have voices because your brain's on the fritz. Whereas, so this whole model of schizophrenia, I'm saying that 25 to 40%, based on a bunch of research and stuff, of people with schizophrenia fit this dissociative subtype, where they're hearing voices that are qualitatively basically the same as voices of people with DID. And people with DID actually have more of the classical symptoms of schizophrenia than people with schizophrenia. So I'm saying that schizophrenia and DID overlap a ton. There's clearly cases of schizophrenia that are something completely different. And forget about doing psychotherapy with those people, who I've met in the emergency. I mean, these are people who are, an hour later, they haven't moved. I mean, so you can't do a psychotherapy session with somebody who's just frozen like that, right? Or they're like, how are you feeling today? You literally can't get words out of them. Or, how are you feeling today? The clarion bell of the evangelist certainly blew. Yeah, blew, it's true. I mean, so this person is hugely psychotic. There's no way you're going to do psychotherapy with them. But there's a subgroup that basically you could treat their schizophrenia with a very similar psychotherapy as you do for DID. Forming a relationship with the parts, getting to know them, why are they there, how do they feel about things, negotiating between the parts, reframing them as parts of the self that have been disowned, that need to be owned and soothed and healed and brought back into the fold. With people with DID who have auditory hallucinations, who've previously had diagnoses of schizophrenia, who I know personally, who are integrated, they don't hear voices anymore. They don't have blank spells. They don't suddenly change behavior and not remember what they've done. It's all gone. So we look at the list of classical symptoms of schizophrenia. There's a whole history to that. There'll be another hour to talk about. But when you go through the classical Schneiderian first-rank symptoms, which is this guy, Kurt Schneider, came out with a list of 11, they include voices talking to each other, keeping up a run of commentary, made thoughts, feelings, or actions. So that's 3 different symptoms. Your thoughts, your feelings, or your actions are made or controlled by some power or force outside you. And they suddenly intrude in, and you either have to feel the feeling, think the thought, or do the action. So now that's completely different from OCD. Because OCD is a disorder where your thoughts, your feelings, or your actions suddenly intrude from somewhere else and you're compelled to do them. Whereas in psychosis, your thoughts, your feelings, or actions suddenly intrude from somewhere else and you're compelled to think them, feel them. You guys see the difference? Again, there's no difference. It's exactly the same symptom, but if we have a diagnosis of OCD, we call that symptom an obsession or a compulsion. If the diagnosis is psychosis, we call it a made thought, symptom, or action, and it's a biological brain disease problem. The other symptoms include, in the classical list, thought withdrawal and thought insertion. It's exactly the same vocabulary. Thoughts are pulled out of your mind, or thoughts are inserted in your mind that are coming from somewhere else. Thoughts out loud. So there's like thoughts being broadcast in your mind that you hear out loud. They're obviously coming from your mind, but you're listening to them like you're listening to a loudspeaker. So they're coming from a dissociated aspect of your mind. Thoughts ascribed to others. There's somebody else inside my mind thinking their own thoughts. So it's all structural dissociation. So just going over this quickly. So when I was in medical school, I was taught things that doctors do. So in comes the patient, and the patient says, "Doc, my knee's killing me." And I look at the patient and I say, "Oh, this is a woman in her 80s. Okay, how long has your knee been killing you for?" "It's been getting worse for the last 5 years." So since I'm a really, really smart guy and I'm highly, highly educated, I think to myself, I think this is arthritis. Next patient comes in, "Doc, my knee's killing me." So linebacker-sized guy who's a senior in high school. "How long's your knee been hurting you?" "Ever since that linebacker blindsided me." "Oh, I think this is a sports injury." You know, this is how smart doctors are. So you take a history, you figure out what is the nature of the problem, you do some tests, you prescribe treatment. Here's what the doctor does not do. "Okay, thanks for explaining about your symptom. Okay, so knee, how are you feeling today?" So you don't talk to the knee, you don't talk to the symptom, you don't ask the symptom what its point of view is. You work with the patient to help the patient get rid of the symptom. Well, go to medical school, become a psychiatrist. The symptom is an auditory hallucination. "Oh, you're hearing voices? What are they saying?" "Okay, good. Prescription." You don't talk to the voices and ask them how they're feeling. You'd be like, you'd lose your license. Nobody does this in the schizophrenia field, except there is a group of people, mostly in England, who are actually publishing randomized controlled trials of cognitive therapy for psychosis, where they do verbally interact with the voices. They help the person reframe the voice as a disowned part of themselves. They help the person negotiate with the voices. The person may write stuff to the voices, may say things to the voices, which is kind of like a quarter of DID therapy without exactly admitting that's what they're doing. So it's a completely revolutionary different relationship between the doctor, the patient, and the symptom. The symptom, the voice, is just as much the patient as the patient. And you want to form a treatment relationship with the symptom just as much as you do with the patient. It's a completely different approach to things. And mainstream guys don't want to hear about it. So which brings us to the last disorder. So this is an interesting thing because this is a DSM-4 diagnosis, somatization disorder, which was also in DSM-3, in a section called somatoform disorders. Now there's no section called somatoform disorders in DSM-5. It's somatic symptom disorder and related disorders. So the lead diagnosis in the somatoform disorders was somatization disorder, which is basically a lot of symptoms lasting for a long time. You have to go see a doctor, and the doctor has to find no physical explanation for the symptoms. So part of the criteria to get the diagnosis, you had to see the doctor had to find no reason for the symptoms, meaning no physical reason. Now in DSM-5, so in DSM-3 you required 13 symptoms. DSM-4 was only 8 or so, but it was a bunch of symptoms. In DSM-5, there is no somatization disorder. It doesn't exist anymore, it's gone. We cured the planet. The lead diagnosis is somatic symptom disorder. You only require one symptom, and you don't have to go to a doctor, and there doesn't have to be no physical explanation. So I actually had data sets with my standardized structured interview that asked about all these symptoms, this whole symptom list. And so I could do, in 3 different populations, how common is somatization disorder, what's the average number of psychosomatic symptoms in general population, people with dissociative identity disorder, other categories, and how common is somatic symptom disorder. If you only require one symptom from the list and you don't have to see a doctor, well, amazingly, somatic symptom disorder is way more common than somatization disorder. So this is kind of a crazy mixed up section of the manual. But what is somatization disorder or somatic symptom disorder? In most of the literature on somatoform disorders, they don't talk about trauma, they don't talk about dissociation, they don't talk about sexual abuse, they don't talk about wounded inner children. It's all a language of communication that women use. They're speaking the language of physical symptoms to try and communicate, get into a relationship with the doctor, and get something because they're too mixed up to speak directly. So it's a slightly more friendly, dismissive, Charcot-Salpêtrière version of the attitude. These are a bunch of women, they don't know that, they can't speak directly, they're always trying to get something, they show you these symptoms because they can't speak in normal language. That's the dominant picture. But what do we know from the actual research? It's a fact that there's a statistical relationship between being female, having a childhood sexual abuse history, and having a lot of psychosomatic symptoms. You can also be male, no childhood sexual abuse, and meet criteria for somatization disorder, but statistically these things tend to go together a bunch of the time, but not all the time. So why would that be? Why, if you're a woman and you have a childhood sexual abuse history, would you have all these psychosomatic symptoms? And what symptoms do we think they might be? So does it make logical sense that if you were sexually abused as a child, you're going to come in and see the doctor because you've got pain in your left elbow? Makes no sense whatsoever. There's no reason for that. So what, in fact, are the symptoms from this long list of different systems? The symptoms from many systems of the body. The typical, most frequent symptoms in women with childhood sexual abuse histories who have somatization disorder, full or half, are gastrointestinal, genitourinary complaints, which doctors can find no physical explanation for. Well, what are those symptoms? Those are the physical sensations of your body while the sexual abuse was going on that have been pushed away in an underground compartment, and then they suddenly intrude in. They're out of context. They're not connected to anything. You come see the doctor. The doctor can't find a physical reason, and he says, you're a hysterical female and you're trying to get attention. That's how it works in the 21st century in the United States of America, most of the time. It's the same story. It's structural dissociation. Instead of a picture, instead of a scared feeling of a little lost, lonely guy whose wife's going to leave him, instead of a compulsion to organize things, it's the physical sensation piece of the memory that's been split off and suddenly intrudes in. So again, all of these different DSM diagnoses in all these different sections of the manual are just variations on the same theme. So you put them in the context of the person's life story. How do you expect a person to be when they've gone through this kind of a childhood? These symptoms totally make sense. They fit in. They're part of a normal mammalian threat response, how human beings react. We need to make sense of this. We need to normalize it. We need to say you're not crazy for no reason. We need a primary treatment of psychotherapy that draws from PTSD and other psychotherapies. And you need to acknowledge this, validate it internally, accept it, own it, learn how to soothe it, bring it into yourself, soothe, manage it, soothe, manage, and then it settles down and goes away. That's the model that does not dominate most of psychiatry today. The other model is basically how do we understand sleep deprivation and insomnia? It's a whole different talk. But one way we treat insomnia is we don't continue the lecture past 9 p.m. So here we are treating insomnia preventively. So thanks for listening. So that's a whole take on the field of psychiatry that you will not get from your standard introductory psychology text or from the average standard psychiatrist. Either believe it or take it with a grain of salt, as you wish.